The call came on a Thursday morning, the kind of morning that already felt wrong before it started. Dina Carver was standing in the parking lot of the gas station where she worked the early shift, the one that started at 5 and ended at 1, the one that paid $11.25 an hour and smelled permanently of burnt coffee and industrial cleaner. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She had 37 minutes left on her shift when her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She almost didn't answer. She recognized the area code as the county courthouse, and courthouse calls were never good news, had never once been good news in the 4 years since Marcus left and took the savings account and the second car and the particular brand of casual cruelty that had made her feel small for a decade. But she answered anyway. That was the thing about Dina. She always answered. The call was from an estate attorney named Gerald Pratt. He spoke in the slow, practiced cadence of a man accustomed to delivering information people weren't prepared for. He told her that her great-uncle Raymond Carver had died 11 days ago, that he had been the sole owner of a parcel of land in Calder County, that the parcel included a structure listed in county records as the Ridgeline Lodge, and that as Raymond's only living relative on the Carver side, Dina had been named in his handwritten will as the inheritor of everything he owned. She asked how much the property was worth. Gerald Pratt paused for 3 full seconds, the kind of pause that meant he was choosing words carefully. He told her the county assessed value was $4,800. He told her the lodge had been vacant for 19 years. He told her there had been one interested buyer a decade ago who walked the property and declined without explanation. He told her the roof of the main structure had partially collapsed on the east side, that the access road was overgrown to the point of being nearly impassable, and that she would be responsible for any back taxes owed, which amounted to roughly $312. Dina stood in the parking lot with the morning light coming up flat and yellow over the gas station canopy. She thought about $312. She thought about the eviction notice she had taped to the inside of her kitchen cabinet 3 weeks ago so that Mia wouldn't see it. She thought about her daughter, who was 9 years old and currently sleeping at her grandmother's house because Dina's apartment building had a mold problem the landlord refused to fix, and the school had started asking questions about Mia's cough. She thought about the balance in her checking account, which was $51.40, and had been $51.40 for 6 days because she was rationing it the way you rationed the last of anything when you weren't sure when more was coming. She told Gerald Pratt she would think about it. She thought about it for exactly 4 hours, which was the length of time it took her to finish her shift, drive to her mother's house, watch Mia eat a bowl of cereal at the kitchen table, and listen to her own mother say the things she had been saying in variations for 2 years. Dina, you need to be practical. You need to think about stability. You can't keep dragging that child from one situation to the next. The lodge was a liability, her mother said. It was a money pit. It was an albatross. It was a ruin in the middle of nowhere that would cost more to tear down than it was worth. Accepting it would mean taking on the taxes, and taxes were just the beginning, because ruins had a way of becoming lawsuits when strangers wandered onto them and hurt themselves. Dina listened to all of it. She nodded in the right places. She drank the coffee her mother made without commenting on the fact that it was weak, because her mother had always made weak coffee and some things were not worth the fight. Then she drove to the county courthouse and signed the paperwork accepting the inheritance. She told herself it was about options. She told herself that even a broken property in the middle of nowhere was something, and something was categorically better than nothing, and nothing was precisely what she had at the moment if she didn't count $51.40. She told herself these things and believed approximately half of them. She called her cousin Bet that night, the one who lived outside of Calder County and had actually grown up hearing stories about Raymond. Bet was 10 years older than Dina, practical in the way of women who had survived their own versions of difficulty, and she had 2 things Dina needed: a truck with a working engine and a general knowledge of where the Ridgeline property actually was. What did he do out there? Dina asked. All those years. Bet was quiet for a moment. You know, I only went once. I was maybe 12. Raymond took me when Dad brought us up for a summer visit. She paused again. He was always a quiet man, kept to himself. The lodge was a hunting retreat, originally. Family built it in the 50s, way before Raymond's time. By the time I saw it, he wasn't using it for hunting anymore. He just lived there, or mostly lived there. Drove into town for supplies every few weeks. She stopped. What? Dina asked. Nothing. It's probably nothing. But I remember thinking the place felt strange. Not bad strange. Just like it was holding something in. Like the walls were heavier than they should be. Dina didn't sleep that night. She lay on her mother's couch with Mia curled against her back and stared at the ceiling and thought about walls that were heavier than they should be. She thought about Raymond, whom she had met exactly twice in her life and who had given her, both times, the impression of a man who knew things he wasn't going to share with you. She thought about the $500 she had decided to take from her small emergency envelope, the one she kept in the back of a kitchen drawer, the one she had told herself she would not touch under any circumstances. She thought about what $500 could actually accomplish. In the morning, she packed 2 bags, one for herself, one for Mia. She told her mother they were going to look at the property. Her mother said, "I hope you know what you're doing." Dina said, "I never know what I'm doing." Her mother didn't laugh. The drive to the Ridgeline property took 3 hours in Betty's truck, 2 of which were on state highways, and 1 of which was on county roads that narrowed progressively until they felt more like suggestions than roads. The last 6 miles were on a dirt track that Bet navigated with the careful tension of someone driving across something that might not hold. The trees on either side were old growth, the kind that had been there long enough to establish their own logic of shadow and light, and the canopy overhead was so dense that even in the afternoon the track felt like evening. Mia sat between them in the cab, watching the trees with the focused attention of a child who found novelty in everything. She had her small sketchbook in her lap and was drawing the tree shapes as they passed, quick gestural lines that somehow captured the lean and reach of old timber. She had been doing this since she was 5, drawing things as they moved past, as if she was afraid that if she didn't capture them quickly they would disappear. "Mom," Mia said, "these trees are really old." "Yeah, baby." "How old?" Bet answered before Dina could. "Some of them could be 200-300 years easy. Maybe more." Mia looked at the sketchbook. "That's before America was America. That's before a lot of things," Bet said. The track ended at a wide, ragged clearing. The lodge stood at the far end of it. Dina had expected a ruin. She had prepared herself, in the particular way you prepare for disappointment when hope has cost you before, for something that was obviously beyond saving. What she found was not that. The Ridgeline Lodge was damaged, was obviously neglected, but it had the bones of something that had once been substantial. The main structure was 2 stories, built from logs that had been fitted with the kind of precision that spoke of a craftsman who took his work seriously. The east wing, where the collapse had occurred, was clearly compromised, the roofline sagging into itself on one corner. But the rest of the structure was standing, and standing straight, in the way of things built to outlast their builders. There were other structures. A long, low outbuilding running along the northern edge of the clearing. A concrete block structure behind the main lodge, door sealed with a padlock that had gone orange with rust. A second smaller outbuilding partially obscured by the tree line, its roof intact, but its door hanging open. And everywhere, the overgrowth, the patient reclamation of nature, vines across the window frames, grass pushing through the joints in the concrete foundation, young saplings growing in the gravel where a driveway had once been defined. Mia climbed out of the truck and stood in the clearing with her sketchbook pressed against her chest, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "It's big," she said. "It's a lot of work," Bet said. Dina said nothing. She was looking at the main lodge and feeling something she couldn't name. Not excitement, not exactly. Something more like recognition, which made no sense because she had never been here, had never met this version of her family's history. But standing in that clearing in the thin afternoon light, the smell of pine and something older, earthier. Underneath, she felt the way you feel when a word you've been trying to remember finally surfaces. Arrived. That was the word. She felt arrived. She walked the property for 2 hours while Bet photographed the structural damage with her phone, and Mia filled 4 pages of her sketchbook. The main lodge had 6 rooms on the ground floor and a loft above, accessible by a staircase that was still solid. The kitchen was intact, with an old cast-iron stove that was worth money if nothing else was. The fireplace in the main room was massive, river stone, the kind built to heat the whole structure. The windows were intact on the west and south faces, broken on the east near the damaged wing. The long outbuilding turned out to be a workshop. It had a concrete floor, a workbench running the full length of one wall, And on that workbench, covered in a decade of dust and debris, were tools. Not ordinary tools. Precision tools, the kind used in metal fabrication and machining. Dina wasn't an expert, but she had worked 3 months in an industrial supply warehouse back when Mia was 2, and she had learned enough to recognize that the equipment on that workbench was not what you expected to find in a hunting lodge in the middle of rural nowhere. She photographed everything. The sealed concrete block building she left alone. The padlock was serious, a heavy-duty mechanism that looked newer than everything else on the property, and the door behind it was steel, not wood. She noted it and moved on. The smaller outbuilding near the tree line held old furniture, wrapped in canvas tarps. She lifted one corner of a tarp and found a chair, good wood, hand-carved. She found another and found a table that had been crafted with the same precise joinery. Under a third tarp was a wooden chest, locked, the kind with a barrel latch rather than a padlock. She didn't open it. When the light started going, the 3 of them sat on the steps of the main lodge and ate sandwiches Bet had packed. Mia leaned against Dina's arm with her sketchbook open and showed her the drawings she had made. The lodge from the clearing. The old trees. A quick sketch of the concrete block building with its rust-orange padlock. And one more. A careful rendering of the workshop bench, the tools laid out in a row. That room felt different, Mia said. Different how? Like someone was just in it. Like they just stepped out. Dina looked at the drawing. The tools were laid out with a specificity that her daughter had captured without understanding what she was seeing. Not scattered. Not abandoned in the way of things left behind in haste or neglect. Arranged. The way a person arranged tools they intended to return to. On the drive back, Bet said the words Dina had been expecting since the moment they'd walked the property. You know this is going to be impossible, right? The back taxes are the easy part. That east wing collapse is structural. The roof on the main lodge needs work. You have no power, no water, possibly no septic. You cannot live there with a child. Dina watched the trees pass. I'm not saying don't keep it, Bet continued. I'm saying don't move in. Get it assessed, figure out what it would take to make it safe, and then decide. Dina thought about the eviction notice in the kitchen cabinet. She thought about $51. She thought about Mia's cough and the landlord who sent form letters instead of fixing mold. What if I don't have time for that process? Bet looked at her sideways. How bad is it? Bad enough. Bet drove for a while without speaking. Then, I can help with the first 2 weeks. I can't do more than that. I've got my own situation. I know. I'm not asking. You're not asking, but here we are. Here we are, Dina said. They drove back through the dark in silence. Mia fell asleep against Dina's shoulder, and her sketchbook slid off her lap, and Dina caught it without looking, the automatic reflexes of mothers. She told her mother that night that she was going to the lodge. Her mother said things. Dina listened. Then she packed more thoroughly, and in the morning, on a Tuesday in March with a cold rain coming down at a 45-degree angle, she drove Betty's truck back up the 6 miles of narrowing track with Mia beside her and everything they actually needed in the truck bed under a tarp. The first week was the hardest and also, in a way Dina would only understand later, the most clarifying. She and Mia slept in the main room near the fireplace, which worked perfectly once Dina cleared the flue of what turned out to be a bird's nest from several seasons ago. She found the well pump in a concrete housing behind the lodge and got it working with a YouTube video, a wrench, and 2 hours of effort that left her hands raw and her knees muddy. The water ran brown for 20 minutes and then ran clear. She stood at the kitchen sink watching it run clear and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Competence. The specific satisfaction of having solved a problem with your own hands. There was no phone signal at the lodge. She had known this from the drive-in and had prepared for it, downloading what she needed, writing out information she might require, charging everything at Betty's house before the final trip. Mia took this better than expected, with the adaptability of children who have learned that stability is not the same as location. She explored the property with the systematic thoroughness of a child mapping territory, coming back to report each discovery with the gravity of an expedition member. Mom, there's a spring behind the big rock at the north edge. It's running. Mom, the workshop has a generator in the back under a cover. It might still work. Mom, there's writing on the inside of the outbuilding door. I can't read all of it, but some of it looks like numbers. Dina followed her daughter to each discovery in turn. The spring was real and cold and clean-looking. though she wasn't ready to drink from it without testing. The generator was real too, a large diesel unit that was older than Mia but appeared to have been maintained, its housing free of rust, oil level visible in the sight glass, and within range. She didn't try to start it yet, not until she understood the power situation better. The writing on the inside of the outbuilding door was what stopped her. Mia had been right. It looked like numbers. But it was more than numbers. It was a grid, drawn in pencil directly on the interior wood of the door, columns and rows of figures and abbreviated notations. Some of the notation she recognized as military time, the 24-hour format. Some of it she didn't recognize at all. The grid had been added to over time. She could see that from the varying pressure and color of the pencil marks, new entries made on top of old ones, dates spanning what looked like a decade or more. She photographed it with her phone and stood back. "What does it mean?" Mia asked. "I don't know yet. Is it a secret?" Dina looked at the grid, at the careful rows, at the precision of the notation that matched the precision of the tools in the workshop. "Maybe," she said. "Let's not tell anyone about it yet." Mia nodded with the seriousness of a child who understood that some information was not for sharing yet, who had learned this lesson the way children learn things they didn't expect to learn, by watching adults navigate the world and absorbing the subtext. The second week brought the first visitor. She heard the truck before she saw it, coming up the access track at a speed that suggested familiarity with the road. It was a dark green pickup, older, with a county seal on the door that she recognized as the sheriff's department. She positioned herself on the lodge steps before it pulled into the clearing, Mia standing beside her, because the position mattered, because standing on your own steps was different from being found inside or running out when startled. The man who got out of the truck was in his 50s, lean, with the kind of face that had spent decades in weather. He wore a deputy's uniform, but his manner was more neighbor than law, unhurried, hands visible. He looked at the lodge, looked at Dina, looked at Mia. "You'd be Raymond's people," he said. "Not a question." "His niece," Dina said. "Grandniece, technically. I inherited the property." He nodded. "I'm Walt Pruitt. I was the county deputy who responded when Raymond was found. I worked this county 30 years. I knew Raymond as well as anybody did, which wasn't especially well, but better than most." "He died alone?" Dina asked. "He was found 3 weeks after the fact." There was a pause that contained a lot. "He chose his life carefully, the way some men do." Dina waited. "I drove up to let you know a few things," Walt said. "1. The property line on the north side is disputed. Has been for 12 years. Neighbor named Hollis Vance. He'll come around. He's not dangerous, but he's persistent, and he'll try to convince you that the north 40 acres aren't yours. They are. Raymond had the survey done in 2014 and won the dispute in county court. Don't let Hollis Vance tell you different." "What's the second thing?" Dina asked. Walt looked at the lodge for a moment, then back at her. "Raymond asked me, about 2 years before he died, to make sure that whoever inherited the property got a message from him. He asked me in person, and he also wrote it in a letter that he filed with the estate attorney, so it's official." He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope. Not sealed. He held it out. Dina took it. Inside was a single sheet of paper in handwriting that was cramped and careful and slightly shaky in the way of old hands that had lost some of their precision. She read it there on the steps with Mia leaning against her hip. "To whoever inherits the Ridgeline property, which I expect will be a Carver or married to one. The lodge and land are yours, and I hope you'll use them. But I'm writing to tell you one thing. Don't trust the concrete building. Don't open it alone. Don't open it without understanding first what it is. I spent 30 years understanding it, and I still got some of it wrong. Find someone who knows what they're looking at before you go in. What's in there belongs to a history that is bigger than me and might be bigger than you. But it's yours now. Be careful with it. Raymond." Dina read it twice. She folded it and put it back in the envelope. She looked at Walt. "Do you know what's in the concrete building?" Walt looked at the lodge roof for a moment. "Not specifically. Raymond wasn't a man who shared what he knew. But I have my suspicions, and my suspicions have told me for 30 years to leave that building alone." "What kind of suspicions?" Walt put his hands in his jacket pockets. "Raymond worked for the federal government," he said, "before he retired here, before he came back to the family land. He didn't talk about what he did, the way certain people who work for the government don't talk about what they did. What I know is that in 1987, there was a period of about 6 months where this property had a lot of unusual activity. Vehicles I didn't recognize. people I didn't recognize. And then it stopped, all at once, and Raymond stayed, and everyone else left. He looked at Dina. That's what I know. The rest I don't. He drove away down the track and left them in the clearing with the letter and the questions. Mia had been listening to all of it with the focused quiet she adopted when she was processing something she didn't yet have words for. What did great Uncle Raymond do for the government? She asked. I don't know, Dina said. Are we going to find out? Dina looked at the concrete building with its steel door and its heavy padlock. Yeah, she said. We are. But not yet. That night, Dina sat at the table in the main room with her phone and all the photographs she had taken and the letter from Raymond and the photograph she had found on the first day inside the lodge, a framed photograph that had been hanging in the hallway. She had noticed it when she was checking the structural integrity of the interior walls and had taken it down to look at it more closely. The photograph showed 3 men standing in the clearing where the outbuildings were. The lodge was behind them, looking newer. They were in military dress, 2 in what looked like army uniforms, 1 in civilian clothes. The one in civilian clothes was Raymond, younger, perhaps 40. He was holding what appeared to be a rolled document, the kind of large format plans you carry in a tube. The other 2 men were standing with the upright posture of people in uniform who are accustomed to standing straight. Behind them, partially visible, was a 4th structure that no longer existed on the property, a larger outbuilding that had apparently been demolished or dismantled since the photo was taken. She had no way to know when the photo was from. But the detail that had kept her attention was the concrete block building in the background of the image. In the photo, it had no door. Where the steel door now was, there was open space. Whatever was inside the concrete building had been brought in after this photo was taken and sealed in with a door that was built to last. She set the photograph down and looked at the grid on the outbuilding door, the image she had on her phone. She looked at it for a long time, the way you look at something when you are trying to understand it not by decoding it, but by feeling its shape, the shape of intention behind it. She thought about Raymond, who had lived alone on this property for 30 years after everyone else left, who had maintained the generator and the workshop tools and the precision of a man who was still working even when no one was watching, who had written a letter about a building he'd spent 30 years not quite understanding. She thought about the tools on the workbench, metal fabrication equipment, machining tools, not the tools of a retired man passing the time, the tools of someone who was still making things. She thought about the grid on the door, the columns of figures and dates. She thought about the 4th structure in the photograph, the one that no longer existed. And she thought about what Walt Pruitt had not said, the way certain silences carried weight, the way he had looked at the concrete building when she asked what his suspicions were, and then looked away at the lodge roof instead. She made a decision. She would not open the concrete building. Not yet. Raymond's letter had been clear on that point, and she respected the clarity of it. But she would start working through everything else on the property, every room, every drawer, every surface, every space between surfaces, until she had enough context to understand what she was walking toward. Mia fell asleep early that night, curled near the fire with her sketchbook under her pillow the way some kids kept stuffed animals. Dina sat up and read through the documents she had copied at the courthouse before leaving, the property records, the tax history, the survey documents from 2014. She read through the inventory list from the estate attorney, which described the property as containing a main lodge, 3 outbuildings, and a storage facility of concrete block construction, no contents listed for the storage facility, which was either an oversight or a choice. Around 2 in the morning, she found something. It was in the property tax records from 1987, the year Walt Pruitt had mentioned. There was a notation on that year's assessment, 1 line, the kind of bureaucratic entry that looked unremarkable unless you were specifically looking for something unremarkable. The notation read, parcel value modified per Federal Exemption Order 14C, additional structure assessed separately, not included in county valuation. She read it 3 times. Additional structure, assessed separately, not included in county valuation. The 4th building in the photograph. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The first person who came to mock her arrived on the 6th day. She had driven into the nearest town, 12 miles away, a place called Calder Crossing with a gas station and a feed store and a diner that had been there since the early 70s if the signage was any indication. She needed propane canisters for the camp stove she'd been using to supplement the cast iron stove, and she needed coffee, and Mia needed paper for her sketchbook. The woman at the counter of the feed store was in her 60s, with the kind of expression that suggested she had made up her mind about most things already and was not open to revision. Her name tag, said Lorraine. She looked at Dina with the specific attention of a small-town woman looking at a stranger who has come to stay. You're the one who took Raymond's property, Lorraine said. Not quite a question. I inherited it, Dina said. That's the same thing, Lorraine said. That place hasn't had a working person on it in nearly 20 years. Raymond didn't count. He was barely on it himself the last years. She rang up the propane canisters. You're planning to live up there? For now? With a child? My daughter, yes. Lorraine looked at Mia, who was examining a display of work gloves with the thoroughness of a quality control inspector. She looked back at Dina. The roof on that main building needs $4,000 minimum, if it's just the east wing. More if they find rot in the main structure when they get up there. The outbuildings are worse. The road alone would be $10,000 to make it properly passable year-round. And that's before you talk about permits, before you talk about bringing power in, before you talk about any of the dozens of other things a place like that needs. Dina kept her face even. I know. Do you? Because people come out here and they see land, and they see possibility, and they don't think about what possibility costs. I know what things cost, Dina said. I've been calculating costs my whole adult life. Lorraine looked at her for a moment. Then she put the propane canisters in a bag. I'm not being unkind, she said. I'm being practical. I know, Dina said. And she paid for the propane and the coffee and Mia's paper and drove back up the narrowing track in the rain. She told Mia nothing about the conversation. Mia was old enough to understand that some adults communicated discouragement the way weather communicated cold, as a fact rather than a judgment, and Dina didn't want her daughter absorbing someone else's certainty about what was possible. That evening, starting her systematic search of the lodge interior, she found the first cache in the kitchen floor. She found it because one of the floorboards near the cast iron stove made a different sound under her feet, not hollow exactly, but resonant in a way the other boards were not. She knelt and pressed along the seams. Found the groove. Found the lift point, a small brass fitting flush with the wood, invisible unless you knew it was there. The space beneath was not large. A foot deep, perhaps 2 feet square, lined in aluminum foil that was old but intact. Inside were 3 things: a sealed metal box about the size of a hardback book, a glass jar with a rubber-sealed lid containing what appeared to be rolled documents, and a small notebook with a cover of black cloth. She sat back on her heels and breathed for a moment. Then she photographed everything in place before touching anything. The notebook was first, because it was the thing most likely to tell her what the other things were. She opened it carefully, the way you open something old that might not survive roughness. Raymond's handwriting, cramped and careful and slightly shaky in the way of the letter. The first entry was dated 1991. The last was dated 2 years before he died. Between those dates, 30 years of entries, some long, some only a few lines. She read the first page and the last page and several pages from the middle. The first page said, I am writing this for the person who comes after me, because someone will come after me and they deserve to understand what they have inherited. The short version is this. This property is a repository, not for things I put here, though I have added to it over the years. For things that were here before I came back. Things that were placed here in 1987 during a period that is officially described as a communications infrastructure maintenance project and is not that. What is actually here is something I have spent 30 years trying to understand completely. I have not succeeded, but I know enough to write it down. The last page said, I leave this knowing the person who finds it will have questions I cannot answer from where I am. But I have tried to give them enough to find the right answers themselves. The building on the north side of the main clearing, the concrete one, is the center of it. Everything I have put in the lodge is context. The building is the subject. Don't be afraid of it, but don't be careless with it. It took me 30 years, and I was trained for exactly this kind of work. Give yourself time. Dina set the notebook down on the kitchen table. Mia was asleep upstairs, worn out from a day of exploration that had taken her to the spring and back twice, and included a lengthy investigation of the old outbuilding furniture. Outside, the fire crackled and the March wind worked at the window frames, and the lodge made the sounds old buildings make when they are settling into their foundations. She opened the glass jar and unrolled the documents. Maps. Not road maps, not topographic maps, though there were elements of topography. These were structural diagrams. Blueprints in the old sense, white lines on blue ground, hand annotated in pencil, showing a structure in cross-section. Multiple cross-sections from different angles. The structure had 3 levels below grade and 1 above. The one above grade was the concrete block building in the clearing. The 3 levels below, it were something she had no name for yet. But she could see the dimensions written in the margins. 80 feet by 40 feet on the first level below, slightly smaller on the second, smaller again on the third. She could see the ventilation system, the drainage, the reinforced walls. She could see the entry point, the steel door with its lock mechanism, and below it, the internal staircase. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The fire burned down, and she fed it without taking her eyes off the blueprints. She thought about $4,800 of county-assessed value. She thought about the eviction notice in her kitchen cabinet at an apartment with mold on the walls. She thought about the $500 she had spent to get here, which was basically everything she had, and about Lorraine at the feed store saying, "Do you know what possibility costs?" and about the way Raymond had written, "Give yourself time." She rolled the blueprints carefully and put them back in the jar. She put the notebook in her own bag, where it would be safe. The metal box she left closed for now. She turned off the lamp and sat in the firelight and listened to the lodge settle around her and thought about 3 levels below grade and what a man who had worked for the federal government, who had maintained precision tools for 30 years in a remote workshop, who had logged dates and figures in a grid on a door in handwriting that didn't shake even when his other handwriting did, might have been doing down there. She thought about Walt Pruitt not answering when she asked what his suspicions were. She thought about the assessment notation, additional structure, assessed separately, not included in county valuation. She thought about what it meant that the county had assessed a structure separately from the rest of the property, which meant someone in the county assessor's office had known the structure existed, and had chosen to keep it separate, and had used a federal exemption code to do it, and had done all of this in 1987. She thought about what 1987 meant, in terms of the country and its history and the things that had been happening that year that were not the kind of things you put in property tax records using real language. She thought about all of this, and when she finally went to sleep, it was nearly 4 in the morning, and the fire had burned down to coals, and the lodge was cold enough that she could see her breath. She pulled the blankets up and listened to Mia breathing in the loft above, steady and regular, and felt the thing she had been feeling since the clearing arrived. Still, even now. In the morning, Mia came downstairs and found Dina at the table with the blueprints spread out and asked what they were. Dina looked at her daughter, 9 years old, a child who drew what she saw and asked the questions adults avoided and had handled 2 years of financial instability with a resilience that still astonished Dina on a daily basis. She said, "Their plans. For a building. Our building. The one with the locked door." Mia sat down across from her and studied the blueprints with the same focused attention she brought to everything. After a long moment, she pointed to the lowest level on the cross-section diagram. "What's this space for?" Dina looked at where her daughter was pointing. It was the 3rd level below grade, the largest, the one with the most annotations, in the tightest handwriting, which she had not been able to read in the firelight the night before. She had been saving that space, the way you save a page you're not sure you're ready to read. She leaned forward now and read the annotations in Raymond's cramped, careful hand. She read them twice, and then she sat back and looked at her daughter and thought about how to explain to a 9-year-old that the thing underneath their new property might be a decision point, that it might be the reason Raymond had written "Give yourself time," and also the reason Walt Pruitt had looked at the lodge roof instead of answering her question. She didn't explain it. Not yet. She said, "Go get dressed. We're going to look at the rest of the workshop today." The workshop was where things began to accelerate, not through any single discovery, but through the accumulation of detail, the way a picture made of dots becomes comprehensible only when you step back far enough to see the whole. She had already cataloged the tools, the precision machining equipment, the workbench that ran the full wall, but she had not yet gone through the drawers beneath the workbench, because there were 22 of them, and they were all locked. The key for all 22 was hanging on a nail inside the back of the generator housing. She found it when she was checking the generator oil. A small key, brass, tied to a length of wire with a label in Raymond's handwriting that said simply, "Shop." She unlocked the drawers in sequence, photographing each one before touching anything. Most of them contained exactly what you'd expect in a machinist's shop: precision gauges, drill bits in organized sets, measuring tools, tap and die sets, files in graduating sizes. But the last 4 drawers were different. These contained documents. Folders, organized chronologically. The earliest dated 1987. The latest dated 3 years ago. She carried the folders to the workbench and opened the first one. It was a log. Not like the notebook she had found in the kitchen floor, which was personal. This was a technical log, the kind kept by someone accounting for inventory and condition. Entries numbered and dated and precise. Entries describing items by dimension and composition and condition assessment. The language was technical and abbreviated, and she understood perhaps a third of it. But what she could understand was enough. The items being logged were stored underground. They were stored in a climate-controlled environment. They were assessed on a quarterly basis. The assessments had been ongoing from 1987, which was when the items had arrived, to 3 years ago, which was when the last entry was made. 30 years of quarterly assessments. 30 years of maintenance and inventory checks, performed by Raymond, alone, in the concrete block building with the steel door that was built to last. She pulled out her phone and looked at the photograph she had taken. The grid on the outbuilding door. She understood now what the grid was. It was a simplified version of the log, a quick reference. The columns were item categories. The rows were dates. The figures were condition assessments. Raymond had kept the detailed records in the workshop drawers and the quick summary on the door where he could check it at a glance on his way in and out. She sat on the workbench stool and looked at the folders and thought about the word repository, which was the word Raymond had used in the notebook. Not hiding place. Not storage unit. Repository. The word that meant a place where things of value or significance were kept under controlled conditions by someone responsible for their preservation. Raymond had been a custodian. For 30 years. Alone. What's in the folders? Mia asked from the doorway. She had been exploring the clearing and come back with muddy boots and a sprig of something in her sketchbook as a pressed specimen. Records, Dina said. About what Uncle Raymond was taking care of. Can you tell what it is? I'm working on it. Mia came and stood beside her and looked at the open folder. She pointed at the column headers. What does this one say? The abbreviations sometimes. Dina looked. It said, oh, standard periodic table notation. She felt something shift in her chest. She looked at the next column. PT. The one after that. AG. Gold. Platinum. Silver. She put the folder down on the workbench and sat very still for a moment. Mom, are you okay? Dina looked at her daughter. At her muddy boots and her specimen sprig and her sketchbook under her arm. She thought about $500. She thought about 3 levels below grade. She thought about the annotation she had read in the firelight at 4 in the morning, in the blueprint's margin, in Raymond's cramped and careful hand. She said, I think we need to make a phone call. Mia looked at the folders. I thought we didn't have signal. We don't. We have to drive to town. Is it important? Dina looked at the workshop, at the 22 drawers, at the 30 years of quarterly assessments organized chronologically in folders that a man had kept alone in a clearing in the middle of nowhere because someone had asked him to, and he had said yes, and spent the rest of his life keeping his word. Yeah, she said. I think it might be very important. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She drove the 12 miles to Calder Crossing in the early afternoon with the first folder from the workshop on the passenger seat and Mia beside it. She found signal 2 miles outside of town and pulled over on the shoulder and looked at the folder and looked at her phone. She thought about who to call. She thought about this for several minutes because it mattered. The wrong call could set in motion a process she couldn't control, could bring in people whose interests were not aligned with hers, could turn what was sitting at the bottom of 3 levels of underground space into a legal situation that would consume her for years without giving her anything in return. She had learned enough. In the years since Marcus left and the money disappeared and the world had shown her all its sharpest edges, to understand that what you had and what you got to keep were not always the same thing, and that the difference was often determined by who you told first and how you framed it. She called Bet. Bet listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When Dina finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough to be significant. Then Bet said, read me the column headers again. The abbreviations. Dina read them. Another silence. Then, okay, I know someone. I'm going to give you a number. Don't call anyone else yet. Don't call the county. Don't call any government office. Don't call an appraiser. Call this number. Who is it? His name is Curtis Webb. He's a retired DoD contractor. He consults now for estate attorneys when they have situations involving federal property and inheritance law. He's the person you call when what you've inherited might be complicated. Dina looked at the folder on the passenger seat. Complicated, she said. Yeah, complicated. Don't worry about his fee for the initial call. I'll cover it. Call him. Dina called Curtis Webb while Mia drew the tree line through the truck window. He answered on the second ring with the calm, unhurried manner of a man who had spent a career being the person other people called when they needed someone calm and unhurried. She told him the situation. She told him about the concrete building and Raymond's notebook and the blueprints and the 3 levels below grade. She told him about the log folders and the column headers. Curtis Webb was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then he said, "What county is the property in?" "Calder County." He was quiet again. She heard paper moving in the background. Then he said, "I need you to read me the federal exemption code from the 1987 property tax assessment." The exact code. She had photographed it. She read it to him. 14C. Curtis Webb made a sound she couldn't categorize. Not surprise exactly. Something more controlled than surprise. The sound of someone who has been wondering about something for a long time and has just received information that confirms the wondering was warranted. He said, "I need to come to the property. Not today, not this week. I need to arrange some things first. But I need to come to the property before you do anything else. Can you tell me what it is?" Dina asked. "Not over the phone." He paused. "What I can tell you is this. Raymond Carver was on a very short list of people who were trusted with something significant in 1987. The government called what he was doing a communications infrastructure project, and that is not what it was. What he was actually doing was custodianship of a repository that was established as part of a program that has been classified for 37 years. He stopped. "Are you sitting down?" "I'm in a truck," Dina said. "That'll do." He took a breath. That repository was established because in 1986, a federal agency recovered a quantity of assets from a series of operations that could not be processed through standard channels without triggering audit mechanisms that would have created significant political problems. The assets were moved to 3 locations in rural counties for long-term storage. Your property was one of the 3 locations. Your great-uncle Raymond Carver was the designated custodian for the Calder County site. What happened to the other 2 sites? The other 2 custodians are deceased. Both properties passed out of the relevant families through estate sales in the 1990s. Curtis paused. Your property is the only one of the 3 where the chain of custody was maintained. Dina sat with that for a moment. What does that mean for me? For the inheritance? It means, Curtis Webb said slowly, that you have inherited something that is legally yours under the terms of the original custodianship agreement, which Raymond Carver signed in 1987 and which was specifically designed to transfer title of the repository contents to the custodian's estate in the event of the custodian's death without a designated successor. Because Raymond named you in his will as his heir without designating a separate repository successor, the entire agreement collapsed into your general inheritance. He paused. In plain English, it's yours. All of it. The truck was warm, but Dina felt cold. What is all of it? That's what I need to come to the property to verify. But if the logs are what you've described, and if the federal exemption code is 14C, which it is, then we are talking about a quantity of physical assets that have been in climate-controlled underground storage for 37 years. She heard him breathe. The last internal assessment I can find reference to, in a report that I have access to through my prior clearance, placed the value of the Calder County repository contents at approximately $115 million. Dina said nothing. That was 37 years ago, Curtis continued. Precious metals appreciate, particularly in periods of inflation, of which there have been several since 1987. If the storage conditions have been maintained, which from what you're describing they appear to have been, the current value would be substantially higher. I'd want to verify the contents before giving you a number, but I want you to understand what you may be dealing with before I come, so you can make informed decisions about your next steps. Dina looked through the windshield at the tree line, at the narrowing track that led back to the clearing and the lodge and the concrete block building with its rust-orange padlock and its steel door that was built to last. She looked at Mia, who had stopped drawing and was watching her mother's face with the focused attention of a child reading the room. "Mom," Mia said. Dina held up one finger. To Curtis Webb, she said, "How long before you can come?" He told her 10 days. He told her to photograph everything she could access without opening the concrete building. He told her not to tell anyone else until he arrived. He told her that the legal situation, while ultimately clear in her favor, was the kind of thing that became complicated quickly when the wrong people knew about it, and that he had spent 30 years learning who the wrong people were. She hung up and sat in the truck with Mia and the folder and the tree line. All of that familiar March light falling flat and gray across the county road. She thought about $115 million in 1987. She thought about 3 levels below grade. She thought about Raymond, alone in a clearing for 30 years, maintaining quarterly assessments of things that no one but him was watching. She thought about the letter. What's in there belongs to a history that is bigger than me and might be bigger than you. She thought about Lorraine at the feed store. Do you know what possibility costs? And she thought about her checking account, which had been $51.40 and had been $51.40 for 6 days, and which had never felt more irrelevant than it did at this specific moment on a gray Tuesday in March. She started the truck. "We're going back," she told Mia. What did the man on the phone say? Dina drove. She thought about what to tell her daughter. She thought about the walls of the lodge, heavier than they should be. She thought about what Bet had said, 12 years old in that clearing. The place felt like it was holding something in. She said, "He said that great Uncle Raymond was taking care of something important for a long time. And now it's our turn to take care of it." Mia thought about this. Is it something good? Dina thought about Raymond signing an agreement in 1987 and keeping it alone for 30 years and writing a letter to a person he would never meet and trusting that the right person would find it. "Yeah," she said. "I think it is." They drove back up the narrowing track in silence, the truck moving carefully over the ruts, the trees closing in on either side, old growth, the kind that had been there long enough to know better than to be surprised by anything that happened underneath them. The clearing opened ahead. The lodge stood in the pale afternoon. The concrete block building sat at the edge of the clearing with its rust-orange padlock and its 37 years of kept secrets. Dina parked the truck and sat for a moment looking at the building. She thought about Walt Pruitt looking at the lodge roof instead of answering. She thought about 10 days. She thought about the things you learned over the course of a life that kept insisting on being harder than expected, about the difference between patience and resignation. One was a choice. The other was what happened when you stopped making choices. She was choosing patience. She got out of the truck. Mia got out beside her, sketchbook already open, already drawing the clearing, the lodge, the building, the tree line, capturing it the way she captured everything that moved past her, quickly, carefully, afraid that if she didn't get it down it would disappear. Dina walked to the lodge steps and sat down and looked at the concrete building and thought about 10 days and 37 years and what a man alone in a clearing for 30 years might have known about time. She thought he probably knew a lot about it. She could wait 10 days. The 10 days passed the way waiting always passes when the thing being waited for is large enough to fill all available mental space. Slowly during the days, which were full of practical work and physical effort, and then impossibly fast in retrospect, so that when Curtis Webb's vehicle finally appeared at the end of the access track on a Tuesday morning, exactly 10 days after the phone call, Dina had the strange sensation of both having been waiting forever and of the time having collapsed. Without warning, she had used the 10 days well. That was the discipline she had built over years of difficulty, the understanding that useful work was the only reliable substitute for the kind of anxiety that fed on itself. She patched the broken east wing windows with plastic sheeting she bought in town, sealing them against the rain that came through twice that week in steady gray curtains. She got the generator running, which took 2 days and a detailed consultation with a diesel mechanic in Calder Crossing named Phil, who came up the track with his own truck and spent 4 hours coaxing the old machine back into operation with the focused patience of someone who respected machinery that had been built to last. The generator ran. When it ran well, filling the lodge with the steady mechanical hum of something fulfilling its purpose. She went through the rest of the workshop drawers. She cataloged everything she found in the folder system, making her own corresponding notes in a fresh notebook, building a parallel record that was hers, in her own hand, organized the way her mind organized things rather than the way Raymond's had. The logs covered 30 years of quarterly assessments. Every 3 months, for 30 years, Raymond had descended into the concrete building, checked the climate controls, inspected the storage conditions, assessed the condition of the contents, and logged the results. The entries were consistent and methodical, and almost entirely without emotional content. The records of a man who understood that his job was accurate documentation rather than personal commentary. Almost entirely. In the margins of 3 entries, years apart, Raymond had written notes that were not part of the standard log format. The first, from 1999, 12 years in, and some days I think this was the wrong choice, and some days I know it was the only choice. The second, from 2007, Rachel from the DoD office called today to check the annual status report. She asked if I was managing. I said yes. I didn't say that managing was the whole of my life now. The third, from 2 years before he died, the last marginal note. Whoever finds this should know that what I kept down there is worth keeping. Not just the money of it. The fact of it. Someone said yes when it mattered. That counts for something. Dina copied all 3 into her own notebook. She also, during those 10 days, had 2 more visits from Hollis Vance. The first visit had been the day after Curtis Webb's call, before she was fully clear on the legal situation. Hollis Vance arrived in a truck that was too new for the access road and parked it at the edge of the clearing with the confident air of someone arriving at a property that was partly his. He was in his 60s, thick-shouldered, with the expression of a man who had been right about things for a long time and had stopped finding it necessary to be gracious about it. He introduced himself and then said, without meaningful pause, that he had been in a boundary dispute with Raymond for 12 years and that the north 40 acres of the Ridgeline property were legally his, a matter Raymond had refused to settle properly, and that he hoped Dina would be more reasonable than her great-uncle had been. Dina said she had the survey documents from 2014 and the county court ruling. Hollis Vance said surveys could be wrong and court rulings could be appealed, and that a woman in her situation, meaning a single woman with a child and no obvious resources, would do better to settle this quietly than to fight a legal battle she couldn't afford. Dina said she would pass his contact information to her attorney. Hollis Vance looked at the concrete building. His gaze rested on it for a moment in a way that was specific and deliberate, the look of someone who knew exactly what they were looking at and had been thinking about it for a while. Then he looked back at Dina. She had not imagined it. He left, and she wrote down the look and what it might mean in her notebook. The second visit from Hollis Vance was 3 days later, different in tone. He arrived in the early evening with a woman who turned out to be his wife, Ellen, who brought a casserole dish and introduced herself with the warm, slightly performative friendliness of someone executing a plan. They came inside. Dina served them coffee and accepted the casserole and listened while Hollis, speaking more carefully this time, explained that he wasn't trying to be difficult, that the boundary dispute had always been about a specific strip of land along the North Tree line, that he had grandchildren who played in those woods and had been doing so for years, and that he felt Raymond's stubbornness had made a simple thing complicated. Dina listened to all of it. Ellen Vance looked around the lodge interior with the attentive eyes of a woman cataloging detail. Mia sat at the table and drew both of them in her sketchbook with the focused discretion of a child who understood that she was not the center of this particular conversation. Dina said the same thing she had said before. She had the documents, and she would refer the matter to her attorney. She said it pleasantly and without apology. Hollis Vance left with the tight expression of a man who had expected a different outcome. After their truck cleared the tree line, Mia looked up from her sketchbook. He looked at the locked building, she said. Twice. She turned the book around to show Dina. She had drawn both moments. Hollis arriving, his gaze directed at the concrete building, and Hollis during the coffee conversation, his eyes drifting to the window that faced the same building. Dina looked at her daughter's drawing. Yeah, she said. I saw that too. Curtis Webb arrived in a vehicle that was deliberately unremarkable, a dark gray sedan with no markings, the kind of car chosen by someone who spent a career being inconspicuous. He was in his late 60s, trim, with close-cropped gray hair and the manner of a man who had learned to read rooms quickly and quietly. He came with 2 other people, a woman named Dr. Patricia Osei, whom he introduced as a forensic asset specialist, and a younger man named Daniel Tran, who carried cases of equipment and spoke rarely. They spent the first hour on the lodge steps while Curtis read the documents Dina had assembled, the notebook from the kitchen floor, the photograph of the 3 men, the property tax notation, the blueprints, and her own notebook with the parallel log entries and the 3 marginal notes from Raymond. He read all of it without comment, the way professionals read things, absorbing rather than reacting. When he finished, he set everything down on the step beside him and looked at the concrete building for a long time. The 14C exemption code, he said finally, was used in a window between 1984 and 1991. After 1991, it was discontinued. There are exactly 11 recorded uses of it in federal property records, spread across 7 states. Of those 11, Dina, 3 involved repositories of what was then called emergency strategic reserves. Physical assets, not financial instruments. Not bonds, not certificates. Physical precious metals and certain other materials that were moved out of standard federal custody during a specific 18-month period for reasons that are still classified, but which I can tell you, from my time in contract work, had to do with the particular political concerns of 1986 and 1987 regarding asset vulnerability. Dina said, "What does asset vulnerability mean in that context?" It means there were people inside the government who believed, with some justification at the time, that certain conventional storage facilities might be accessible to hostile actors in the event of a specific kind of escalation. The reserves were dispersed, moved to locations that had no official connection to federal infrastructure. Rural properties held by individuals who had demonstrated, through prior service and background evaluation, the kind of reliability the program required. Raymond's government work, Dina said. He was signals intelligence, Curtis said. 31 years. He was exactly what they were looking for. Isolated property, prior clearance, demonstrated discretion, and no family on site to complicate security. He accepted the custodianship in 1987, and he kept it for 30 years without a single breach. Dr. Osei had been walking a slow perimeter of the concrete building while Curtis spoke, examining the exterior without touching it. She came back now and said, "The ventilation ports are intact. That's significant." The climate system was still operational as of the last log entry, which means the storage conditions have been maintained for the full period. "How do you know the ventilation ports are intact?" Dina asked. "Because if they weren't, there would be condensation staining on the concrete in predictable locations, and there isn't any." She said it without condescension, the way someone answers a reasonable question. The exterior construction is military grade. They built these things to outlast the programs that created them. Curtis looked at Dina. "Before we open it, I want to explain the legal framework clearly so there's no ambiguity." He explained it clearly. The 1987 custodianship agreement had been drafted by a federal legal team with the specific intention of ensuring continuity of asset control. The agreement transferred ownership of the repository contents to the designated custodian upon their assuming the role, subject to certain conditions regarding maintenance and confidentiality. Raymond had met those conditions for 30 years. Upon his death, with no designated successor, ownership transferred in full to his general estate under a standard inheritance provision that had been written into the agreement at Raymond's insistence, according to Curtis, because Raymond had been a careful man. "What about the federal government?" Dina asked. "Can they reclaim it?" Curtis paused in the way of someone being precise rather than evasive. The program that created the repositories was formally dissolved in 1993. The dissolution agreement included a provision releasing federal claim to any repository contents for which a continuous chain of private custodianship could be demonstrated. Raymond's logs constitute that demonstration. His 30 years of quarterly assessments, maintained in his own hand, dated and consistent, are exactly the documentation the dissolution agreement specified as qualifying evidence. He looked at her. "You have the logs." "I have all of them." Dina had organized them in order before Curtis arrived. 30 years in sequential folders, the full record. "Then the contents are yours," Curtis said. "Legally and completely." He paused. The political complexity is different from the legal clarity. There will be people who argue otherwise. There will be federal interests that surface once this becomes known. I would advise establishing legal representation before the contents are publicly disclosed, and I would advise controlling the timing of disclosure carefully. Dina looked at him. "When can we open it?" He looked at Dr. Osei. "Patricia?" Dr. Osei was studying the padlock. "Give me 20 minutes to check the ventilation integrity from the inside before anyone else goes in. I want to confirm air quality." These deep storage environments can accumulate problems over time, even with functioning ventilation. 20 minutes, Dina agreed. She sat on the lodge steps with Mia while Dr. Osei worked. Mia had her sketchbook out, drawing Dr. Osei at the door with the precision equipment she'd brought from Daniel's cases. Curtis Webb stood nearby with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching the tree line, the posture of a man who scanned by habit. "Mom," Mia said quietly, "what's actually in there?" Dina had thought about how to answer this. She'd been thinking about it for 10 days. She said, "We don't know for certain yet, but we think it might be something that changes things for us." "Like how?" Dina watched Dr. Osei work. "Like a lot of different ways," she said. Mia drew for a while. Then, "Is it enough that we don't have to leave?" The question landed with the particular weight of things children say when they've been carrying knowledge they pretended not to have. Dina looked at her daughter. She thought about the eviction notice. She thought about $51.40. She thought about the mold and the landlord and the school asking about Mia's cough. She said, "Yes, I think it's enough for that." Mia nodded as if confirming something she'd already suspected and went back to drawing. Dr. Osei emerged from the building after 18 minutes and gave a brief nod. "Air quality is fine. The ventilation system is functioning." She looked at Dina. "Are you ready?" Dina stood up from the steps. She looked at the concrete building, the steel door, the padlock that had gone rust orange over 37 years of waiting. She thought about Raymond signing a document in 1987 and spending the rest of his life keeping his word. She thought about the letter, "Be careful with it." She said, "Mia stays here." Mia opened her mouth and Dina said, "Not because it's not yours, but because I want to see it first and then come back and describe it to you, so you can draw it right." Mia closed her mouth and considered this. "Okay," she said, "but you have to describe everything." "Everything," Dina agreed. Curtis produced a key from his jacket. Not the rust-orange padlock, which was Raymond's and which Dina kept. A second mechanism, internal, a security system inside the steel door that Curtis had researched through his prior access and come prepared for. The heavy padlock opened on Raymond's key, which Dina had found taped to the inside back cover of the workshop inventory notebook. The internal mechanism opened on Curtis's key. The steel door swung outward on hinges that were as smooth and balanced as the day they'd been installed, the kind of engineering that had been designed to function in a specific temperature range and had been kept in exactly that range for 37 years. The air that came out was cool and dry and had no particular smell, which Dr. Osei said was the correct result and indicated properly functioning climate control. Beyond the door was a concrete staircase descending in a straight line, lit by a strip of LED lighting that ran along the ceiling and had apparently been on a separate power circuit from the lodge, connected to its own small solar array mounted on the roof of the concrete building and concealed behind the parapet wall, which was why Dina had not noticed it. Raymond had thought of everything. They descended single file, Dina behind Dr. Osei, Curtis behind Dina, Daniel behind Curtis with his equipment cases. The stairs were dry and clean, swept regularly in Raymond's time, and still free of the debris that accumulated in spaces left untended. At the bottom of the first flight was a landing and a door, steel again, unlocked from this side, opening into the first level below grade. The first level was a mechanical room. Climate control systems, power management, the infrastructure of long-term preservation. Dr. Osei moved through it with the practiced efficiency of someone checking known systems against known specifications, opening panels, reading gauges, noting readings in her own small notebook. She confirmed what the logs had suggested. Everything was within operating parameters. The system had been running reliably and correctly for 37 years, maintained by Raymond's quarterly checks and occasional component replacements, several of which were noted in the later log entries with part numbers and supplier details. Raymond had thought of everything twice. The second level was accessed by another staircase from the mechanical room. This was where Dina stopped being able to maintain the careful detachment she had built over 10 days of preparation. The second level was a staging area. It had shelving along 3 walls, metal shelving with lipped edges to prevent movement, and the shelving held containers. Metal containers, various sizes, sealed, labeled in a consistent notation system that matched the column headers in the workshop inventory logs. She could read the labels now without abbreviation. They had been spelled out fully here, precisely, in the way of someone creating a system meant to be unambiguous. Oh, gold. The containers labeled with that notation were substantial, each one sealed and marked with a weight and a certification stamp that Dina recognized from the photographs of Raymond's documents as coming from the same federal assay office that had processed strategic reserves in the mid-1980s. PT Platinum. Fewer containers, but the weight notations on these were significant. There were other materials, too. Containers labeled with notations Dina did not recognize, which Curtis translated quietly as she photographed. Specialized rare earth elements. Certain materials that had been strategic reserves in the 1980s for technological rather than purely monetary reasons. Several sealed cases that bore different markings, government archives stenciling, which Curtis examined and then said, very carefully, that those were not metals and that she should let him look at them more carefully before they were moved or opened. She let him look. He looked for a long time, with a portable magnifier from Daniel's case and a reference document he had brought. Then he stood up and said, "Those are bearer bonds. Government issue. Series from the mid-1980s. He paused. They are negotiable instruments, meaning they belong to whoever holds them. He paused again. The series and the serial numbers will need to be verified, but if they are what they appear to be, they add significantly to the total figure. Dina kept photographing. The third level was at the bottom of a third staircase, and it was the largest space. It was also the most organized. Where the second level had been a staging area with the functional arrangement of someone managing working inventory, the third level had been arranged with a different intention. It felt, standing in it, less like a warehouse and more like a vault in the precise historical sense. A space designed not just for storage, but for access and assessment, and the kind of careful engagement that came from regular attention over a long period. The shelving here was different. Smaller and more precise, with individual labeled positions for each item rather than the batch-level organization of the level above. And the items were different too. Not bulk metals or bearer bonds. Individual pieces, documented separately, each with its own small tag in Raymond's handwriting, each tag corresponding to an entry in the workshop logs that Dina had read over the previous 10 days. She had read the log entries. She had read the abbreviations and the measurements and the condition assessments, and she had understood them as data, as inventory, as the responsible record of a careful custodian. Standing in the third level and seeing the items themselves, seeing what the data described, was a different experience. Numismatic coins. Not common currency. Rare coins, the kind that had been pulled from general circulation and cataloged individually because their value was historical and unique rather than merely monetary. Raymond's tags identified them. Date, mint, certification, condition grade. Some of them she recognized from a general sense of what constituted numismatic rarity. Others she did not recognize, but which Dr. Osei did, moving slowly along the shelves and making short, specific sounds that were not quite words. Artifacts. The cases on the far wall of the third level held items that were not metals or currency. Raymond's logs had designated them separately from the other materials, with a notation she had read as unrelated asset category, which she had understood as a catch-all for things that didn't fit the main inventory system. Standing in front of the cases, with Daniel's work light illuminating them through the clear fronts, she understood what unrelated meant in Raymond's system. Not unrelated to the other items in the repository, but unrelated to the primary purpose of the repository. These had come separately, arrived through a different channel, been stored here as a secondary matter by someone who needed a secure location and knew that Raymond's repository was exactly that. The artifacts were military. Historical military equipment, personal effects, and documents, the kind that accumulated in the course of specific operations and which, for reasons that would require research she could not yet do, had been routed here rather than to the National Archives or the military museum system. She would need experts for those. Different experts than the ones standing with her now. "How long have we been down here?" Dina asked. Curtis checked his watch. 42 minutes. She thought about Mia, sitting on the lodge steps with her sketchbook. She thought about the promise she had made. "We need to go up," she said. "I need to tell my daughter." She came back up the stairs into the afternoon light, into the smell of pine and cold air and the particular sensory richness of the world above ground after 42 minutes below it. Mia was exactly where she had been, sketchbook open, a drawing of the building entrance taking shape on the page. She looked up when Dina appeared. "Well?" she said. Dina sat down on the steps beside her. She was quiet for a moment. She was trying to locate the right words and finding that the right words were not near the surface yet, that the experience of the third level in particular was still assembling itself into something she could articulate. You know how I said it was enough that we don't have to leave? Dina said. Yeah, it's more than that. Mia looked at her. How much more? Dina thought about Curtis Webb's voice on the phone, calm and careful, saying $115 million in 1987 dollars. She thought about 37 years of appreciation. She thought about bearer bonds and numismatic coins and rare earth materials, and the third level with its individually documented items and Raymond's careful tags. She thought about the answer to how much more and felt the vertigo of it, the specific dizziness that came from a number that had no personal precedent, that belonged to a scale she had never operated in and had not trained herself to think about, because there had been no reason to. She said, I'm going to need some time to understand all of it. But I think it means we never have to be afraid about money again. Not us. Not you. Not anyone who needs us. Mia was quiet for a moment. She looked at her drawing of the concrete building. She drew a few more lines. Then she said, I knew it was something big. It felt like something big. How did it feel? Like when a word you can't remember finally comes. Mia looked up. Like arrived. Dina stared at her daughter. Mia shrugged with the mild air of someone reporting an observation rather than a revelation. That's what it felt like. She went back to drawing. Can I go in now? Dina said yes. Mia went in with her sketchbook and came out 40 minutes later with 8 pages of drawings and a focused, inward expression that she wore when she had processed something large and was organizing it internally before discussing it aloud. She sat beside Dina on the steps and looked at the afternoon light on the clearing. Great Uncle Raymond was alone for a long time, she said. A long time, Dina agreed. He could have taken some of it. Nobody would have known. No, he didn't, though. Mia considered this. He must have believed the right person would come. Dina looked at the concrete building with its open steel door. She thought about Raymond, in 1987, signing his name to an agreement that would shape the next 30 years of his life. She thought about what it meant to believe, in a clearing in the middle of nowhere, that the right person would eventually come. Yeah, she said. I think he did. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The days that followed moved on 2 tracks simultaneously, and in the way of things moving on 2 tracks, they sometimes created a disorienting friction, a sense that the world was operating at 2 different speeds at once, and that she was standing at the intersection. The practical track involved Curtis Webb, who stayed at a motel in Calder Crossing for the following 2 weeks and drove up the access road every morning in his unremarkable sedan to work through the legal and logistical architecture of what the repository contents represented. He brought in additional specialists, each one vetted through his own network, each one bound by the kind of non-disclosure agreements that Curtis drafted with the specificity of someone who understood what confidentiality actually required. A numismatist named Dr. Frank Solis, who came for 3 days and spent most of that time in the third level with a magnifying glass and a reference library that took 2 cases to transport. A metals analyst named Vera Johansson, who brought spectrographic equipment and worked through the second level in systematic sections, confirming compositions and weights and certifications against the historical records Curtis had sourced through his prior clearance connections. A legal team from a firm in the state capital that Curtis recommended, 3 attorneys who specialized in estate law with federal components, who read Raymond's documents and the custodianship agreement and the dissolution provision and the 30 years of quarterly logs, and then spent an afternoon in a conference call with Curtis that Dina was not party to, after which the lead attorney called her and said, with the careful emphasis of someone trying to be clear without being alarmist, that the legal position was exactly as Curtis had described it, that the contents were hers, that the process of establishing formal documentation of that ownership would take time and require care, and that she should not discuss the situation with anyone outside the professional circle they were building until that documentation was in place. The numbers came in increments. Dr. Solis provided his assessment of the numismatic collection at the end of his 3rd day. He sat across from Dina at the lodge kitchen table with his notes and spoke in the measured, almost affectless tone of professionals who have learned that attaching emotion to numbers introduces error. He said the collection was exceptional. He said several pieces were singular, without duplicates in any known public or private collection, which meant the market for them was limited but not absent, which meant the valuation was a range rather than a fixed figure, which he quoted as between $47 million and $71 million, depending on auction conditions. Dina wrote down both numbers. Vera Johansson's metals assessment came 2 days after that. She had weighed and analyzed and certified the gold and platinum holdings against the historical inventory logs and found them consistent in every measurable respect. The metals themselves had appreciated over 37 years as precious metals did, particularly through the inflationary periods of the preceding decade. She gave Dina a figure for the gold holdings, a figure for the platinum, and a combined figure for the rare earth materials, which she noted had appreciated far beyond the metals because of the specific technological applications they supported and the way supply chains for those materials had evolved over 30 years. Dina wrote down all the figures. Curtis handled the bearer bonds himself, with assistance from Daniel and a specialist he brought in for a single day from a financial institution he declined to name. The bonds were authenticated and their current value calculated, which involved understanding both the face value and the accumulated interest over the decades since issue. The figure Curtis presented to Dina was specific and confident, and she had to read it twice to be sure she was reading it correctly. She was. The other track, running alongside the practical one, was the one that happened in the clearing and the lodge and the access road and the 12-mile drive to Calder Crossing. This was the track on which nothing had been formally resolved, but everything was changing anyway, in the way things changed when the premise of your daily life shifted and the world had not yet caught up with the shift. On this track, Lorraine at the feed store stopped implying that Dina was being impractical. The shift was subtle, the kind of thing that might be imagined, but Dina had spent years learning to read subtle signals in the behavior of people who had decided whether you were worth their time. Lorraine asked, on Dina's 4th visit to buy propane and coffee, whether she was planning to fix the roof. Dina said yes. Lorraine said there was a contractor in the next county who had done good work on old structures and gave her the name without being asked. This was different from what had come before. Phil the diesel mechanic drove up the access road twice more to check the generator, each time declining payment in a way that was specific enough to suggest it was a decision rather than a gesture, that he had made up his mind about something and was acting on it. Walt Pruitt came back once, on a morning when the spring light was finally becoming warm enough to mean something. He sat on the lodge steps with a coffee Dina made him and looked at the cleared access road, which she had been working on with a rented brush cutter, and at the east wing, where a local contractor had begun preliminary work on the structural damage. You're fixing it up, Walt said. Working on it, Dina said. He looked at the concrete building, whose door was closed now and locked with a new padlock, heavy duty, the kind that didn't go rust orange. He didn't ask about it. She noticed that he didn't ask about it and filed the noticing. What happens to the lodge? Walt said. Eventually. Dina had been thinking about this. She had been thinking about it since the night she sat with the blueprints and the log entries and understood what Raymond had been protecting and why. She had been thinking about it in the way you think about large things when you are still in the process of understanding the scale of them, not with a plan, but with a direction. I want to keep it, she said. Fix it properly. Actually live here. Walt looked at the clearing, the old trees at the edge, the spring light on the lodge logs. That's a good answer, he said. Hollis Vance came a 3rd time. He came alone this time, without Ellen, and he came in the early morning before anyone else arrived, which was either bad timing on his part or an attempt to find Dina without the professional circle that had been coming and going. She had been up since 5, the gas station shift schedule still in her body regardless of its irrelevance, and she was in the workshop when she heard his truck. She came out of the workshop and met him in the clearing with her notebook under her arm and the kind of stillness she had developed over the previous 2 weeks, the stillness of someone who knew things and was being careful about what she said and when. He didn't approach the concrete building this time. He stood near the lodge steps and looked at her. He said he wanted to propose a resolution to the boundary dispute. He said he had spoken to a surveyor and that the strip of north acreage was complicated, that there were historical documents suggesting a fence line that predated the 2014 survey, and that he was prepared to take the matter back to county court. Dina said she had legal representation and that all communications about the boundary dispute should go through her attorneys. Hollis Vance looked at her for a moment with an expression she recognized. She had seen it on Marcus's face once, near the end, when he had expected a specific outcome and found instead that the outcome had been removed from his jurisdiction. It was the expression of someone recalculating from an assumption that had turned out to be wrong. He left. She wrote down the time in her notebook. That evening, Curtis Webb sat with her at the kitchen table, and she showed him the log of Hollis Vance's visits, the times, and what had been said, and what had been notably absent from what was said. Curtis read it carefully and then set it down and said, "Do you know what Hollis Vance did before he retired?" "No. He was a federal contractor. Signals infrastructure. He worked the same general government sector as Raymond, about 15 years later in the timeline." He paused. "There's no indication in anything I've found that he knew specifically about the repository. But people who work in a sector long enough sometimes develop a general sense of what exists in their region, even without specific knowledge." "He knew something was here," Dina said. "He suspected something was here," Curtis corrected. "And then you arrived and started having professional visitors, and the suspicion became more focused." He looked at her. "The boundary dispute is a pretext. What he wants is proximity. The North 40 acres would give him a legitimate reason to be on and near the property." Dina thought about Hollis standing in the clearing looking at the concrete building. The specific quality of that look. "I need the documentation in place before this gets more complicated," she said. Curtis nodded. "We're close. 2 weeks, maybe 3. 2 weeks, Dina said. He looked at her across the kitchen table. "You've been remarkably steady through all of this." "I've been practicing steadiness for a long time," Dina said. 2 days later was the day everything shifted from procedural to real. It was the day Dr. Solis called from a number she now recognized and said he had completed his written assessment and would be submitting it to the legal team, and that he wanted to tell her one thing before it went into formal documentation. He wanted to tell her that in 40 years of numismatic work, he had never seen a collection of that integrity in private hands. He said that 3 of the pieces in the 3rd level were, in his professional opinion, not merely rare, but genuinely irreplaceable. Coins that existed in no public collection and in no documented private collection, that had been unaccounted for in the numismatic record since the 1940s, and whose presence in Raymond Carver's repository would, when it became known to the academic and collector community, constitute a discovery of the kind that happened perhaps once in a generation. She thanked him. She sat for a long time after the call. Vera Johansson called the same afternoon with a technical question about one of the rare earth elements and, while asking it, mentioned as a conversational aside that she had done valuation work for 3 national museums and 2 sovereign wealth funds in the previous decade, and that the Ridgeline materials were, on a per square foot basis, the highest concentration of assessed value she had personally encountered in her career. She said it the way she said everything, without emphasis, as data. Dina wrote it down. That night, after Mia was asleep, Dina sat at the kitchen table and looked at the numbers she had written down over the previous 2 weeks. The numismatic collection, the gold holdings, the platinum, the rare earth materials, the bearer bonds, the figures she did not yet have for the military artifacts, which required a different category of expert and which Curtis had flagged as potentially significant on their own terms. She added the numbers she had. She sat with the total. The total was $345 million, approximate, pending the military artifact assessment and pending the bond verification's final confirmation. $345 million. She had written the figure in her notebook the way you wrote things you needed to look at more than once to believe, in clear block letters, as if the clarity of the handwriting could help the mind accept the scale. She thought about $51.40. She thought about the gas station at 5 in the morning, the smell of burnt coffee, $11.25 an hour. She thought about Mia's cough from the mold and the landlord who sent form letters. She thought about Marcus taking the savings account and the second car and leaving her with a child and a clarity about what she was capable of that she had not previously been required to discover. She thought about Raymond, alone in this clearing for 30 years, making his quarterly assessments, keeping his word, writing in the margins of his logs the things he couldn't say in the formal entries. She thought about him writing that last marginal note, 2 years before he died. "Whoever finds this should know that what I kept down there is worth keeping. Not just the money of it. The fact of it. Someone said yes when it mattered. That counts for something." She thought about that. about someone saying yes when it mattered. Raymond had said yes in 1987 to something that would cost him 30 years of solitude and silence, and he had kept that yes for all 30 of them, and he had never broken it. And he had written a letter to a person he would never meet because he believed that the right person would come and that they deserved to be told the truth. She felt something she had been holding back for 2 weeks, through the legal consultations and the specialist assessments and the careful daily management of a situation that required steadiness, finally come through. Not relief exactly. Not joy. Something older than either of those things. Something that was almost the same as the feeling she'd had standing in the clearing on the first day. Arrived. She had arrived. Not just to the property. Not just to the legal ownership. Not just to the $345 million that were, pending documentation, hers. She had arrived at the place where the thing she had always believed about herself, the thing she had held on to through 4 years of difficulty and $51 checking accounts and eviction notices taped inside cabinet doors, the thing that Marcus's leaving had not managed to take from her even when it took everything else, turned out to be true. That she was the kind of person who answered when it mattered. That she was the kind of person Raymond had waited for. She closed her notebook. She went to the window and looked out at the clearing, at the concrete building with its new padlock, at the tree line, at the stars which were very clear above the old growth because there were no lights for miles to compete with them. She thought, what do you do when everything changes? And then she thought, you start. That was all. You just started. The next morning she called Bet. Not to tell her the figure, not yet, that was still in the confidentiality period, but to tell her that the situation was real and that Betty's initial call to Curtis Webb had been the thing that made it possible to navigate it correctly. Bet said, I didn't do anything except give you a phone number. Dina said, sometimes that's everything. She called her mother next. Her mother listened to what Dina could say without violating the legal guidance, which wasn't much, and then said, in a tone that contained all of the previous 2 years of concern and disapproval compressed into a single sentence. Are you all right? Dina looked out the workshop window at the clearing. At Mia, who was at the spring with her sketchbook, drawing something, capturing it before it disappeared. Yeah, Dina said. I think we're going to be all right. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in a different voice, the one she used when she was saying something true rather than something practical. I knew you were stubborn enough for something. I just didn't know what. Dina laughed. It came out genuine. The kind of laugh you hadn't been prepared for. The kind that meant something had loosened. She spent the afternoon in the 3rd level with Mia, both of them moving slowly through the shelving with their notebooks, Mia drawing each section before they moved to the next, building a visual record that ran parallel to Dr. Solis's technical one. Mia drew with the focused attention she brought to everything, capturing not just the objects but the light and the space and the quality of stillness that the 3rd level had. The particular hush of a room that had been tended for 30 years by someone who understood the weight of what he was protecting. When they came up the stairs into the afternoon light and the smell of pine and the sound of wind in the old trees at the clearing's edge, Mia stopped at the top and looked at the building and then at the clearing and then at her mother. It's real, she said. Not like when you read about something. Actually real. Yeah, Dina said. Actually real. That night she ate dinner at the kitchen table with her notes and her numbers, and the sound of the generator doing its steady mechanical work and the fire doing its older, less mechanical work in the stone fireplace, and she thought about the next steps, which were specific and manageable and nothing like the abstract enormity of the 2 weeks before. The documentation would be complete in 2 more weeks. The legal team would file. The county records would be updated. The professional assessors would submit their formal reports. The process would move from this contained, careful phase into the next phase, which would be different and would require different things from her. She was ready for different things. What she was not ready for, what arrived the next morning before the specialists were due and before Curtis Webb had driven up from the motel, was Hollis Vance's truck, parked at the edge of the clearing, not at the usual spot, but farther in, as if he had driven past his normal stopping point without meaning to or without caring to stop. And Hollis Vance himself, standing not near the lodge steps but near the concrete building, closer to it than he had stood before, looking at the new padlock. Dina came out of the lodge and stood on the steps. He heard her and turned around. They looked at each other across the clearing. She had the stillness she had built. She kept it. I think, she said, without raising her voice, that you should leave now. Hollis Vance looked at her. He looked at the building. He looked back at her with the expression of a man deciding something. You should know, he said, that this isn't going to be simple. Dina kept the stillness. She said, I know it isn't simple. I also know it's mine. He left. She watched his truck clear the tree line, and then stood in the clearing for a moment and looked at the concrete building, and then at the old trees, and then at the sky, which was the pale clear blue of early spring, the blue that meant winter was actually finished, and what came next was going to be different. She went inside and called Curtis Webb. Curtis arrived 20 minutes before the other specialists that morning, which she suspected was not coincidence. He listened to what she described about Hollis Vance standing at the building and the way he had said it isn't going to be simple. He listened without interrupting, which was his way, the practiced attentiveness of someone who had spent a career in situations where details mattered. When she finished, he set his coffee down and said, I had him researched. More thoroughly than what I told you last week. What did you find? He worked for a federal contractor called Meridian Infrastructure Services from 1999 to 2018. Meridian held contracts in signals, communications, and what they classified internally as legacy asset management. That last category is what I spent 2 days on. He paused. There's a record of Meridian submitting an inquiry to the General Services Administration in 2009 regarding, and I'm quoting, unresolved inventory from pre-dissolution programs of the 1984 to 1991 classification period. The inquiry was denied, the program files were sealed, and the matter appeared to close. But the inquiry is in the record. Meridian knew that repositories existed. Hollis Vance worked asset management for Meridian. He may not have known specifically about Calder County, but it appears he knew about the category. And when Raymond died and I inherited the property, he began watching. Curtis said, you were an unknown variable. He didn't know if you knew, didn't know if you'd find anything, didn't know if you'd stay long enough to matter. The boundary dispute gave him a reason to be in contact without showing his actual interest. Can he make a claim on the contents? Curtis was direct. No, the legal chain is closed. Your ownership is documentable and will be documented. What he can do is create noise, which in this context means legal interference, media attention at a damaging time, federal contacts who might use the publicity to raise questions about the dissolution agreement's enforceability. None of those would ultimately succeed, but they would cost time and money and cause stress during a period when you need to be focused on the documentation process. So what do? Curtis looked at the window, at the concrete building visible through it. You've been doing exactly the right thing. You have legal representation. You are not engaging with him directly on matters of substance. You are building the documentary record that will make any interference he attempts run into a wall. He looked back at her. The question is timing. How quickly we complete the process and how controlled the transition to public knowledge is. How long? 14 days. He said it with the confidence of a man who had been managing timelines for 30 years. I've been accelerating the legal team's work because of what you just told me about Vance's morning visit. The bonds are the last piece. Once those are fully verified, the documentation package is complete and we can file. After filing, your ownership becomes a matter of public record and the window for interference effectively closes. 2 weeks, Dina said. 14 days, Curtis said. She had the thought, sitting at that table, that she had already lived through 14 days once and come out the other side standing at the top of a staircase with a steel door open below her. And that 14 more days was nothing, was the smallest unit of time relative to what had already been asked of her. She said, tell me what you need from me. He told her. It was specific and manageable, the kind of task list that was satisfying because it had a form, because doing it meant something was being built. She started on it that afternoon. The days moved. Spring moved with them, coming faster than she had expected, the way spring did in places where winter had been real and the change of season was therefore real. The access road dried out and became passable without the truck's careful negotiation. The East Wing repair progressed from preliminary to active, the contractor arriving 3 mornings a week with a small crew, the sounds of construction becoming. That pleased her every time she looked at it. She answered the phone. Curtis told her it was done. She thanked him. She put the phone in her pocket. Mia looked at her. Well? Dina looked at the lodge. At the East Wing with its new roofline catching the spring light. At the workshop where the generator ran and the tools were clean and the 30 years of logs were organized in their drawers. At the concrete building with its new padlock, sealed again, still holding what it held, what was hers now in a way that public record confirmed and that no telephone call from any federal office could alter. At the old trees at the edge of the clearing, 200 and 300 years old, the kind that had been there long enough to know better than to be surprised by anything that happened underneath them. She said, "It's done." Mia exhaled, slow, like she had been holding something. Then she opened her sketchbook to a fresh page and started drawing the clearing, the lodge, the whole of it, capturing it the way she captured everything, quickly and carefully, afraid that if she didn't get it down it would disappear. It wasn't going to disappear. That was the thing. For the first time in 4 years, the thing they were in was not going to disappear. It was going to stay. They were going to stay. And what came next was not going to be the next crisis, not the next eviction notice, not the next number in a checking account that was too small to matter. What came next was going to be something else entirely. The news broke on a Thursday morning 6 weeks after the filing, which was 6 weeks after Dina had learned to stop measuring time by what might be taken from her and started measuring it by what she was building. It broke the way county news broke in small places, not with a headline, but with a conversation, the particular velocity of a story that moved from the county clerk's office to the feed store to the diner to every front porch in Calder Crossing before anyone had written a single word about it. By the time the regional newspaper called the legal team's office, half the county already knew the broad shape of it, though nobody outside the professional circle knew the number. And the number was the thing that changed the shape of everything when it finally came out. She had known it was coming. Curtis had told her, in the same careful, precise way he told her everything. The filing is public record, and public records get read. And when public records describe an estate of unusual character in a property that has been on the county rolls for decades at an assessed value of $4,800, people notice. He had said she should be prepared for attention. He had said the first wave of attention would come from local sources, smaller, more personal, and that this wave was the one that mattered most to manage well, because the people in that wave were the ones she would be living near for the rest of her life. She had thought about what he said, and then she had called Lorraine at the feed store. Not to tell her everything, to tell her enough. Dina drove the 12 miles to Calder Crossing on a Wednesday morning, 2 days before the story moved on its own, and sat at the counter of the diner next to the feed store and waited for Lorraine to come in for her morning coffee, which she did every Wednesday at 9:15, a fact Dina had established over 6 weeks of observing the rhythms of Calder Crossing. When Lorraine came in and sat 2 stools down, Dina said her name, and Lorraine looked over and Dina said, simply, "I wanted you to hear it from me before you heard it from somewhere else." Lorraine set her coffee cup down, looked at Dina with the specific attention of a woman who had been managing information in a small town for 30 years and knew the weight of a sentence like that. "What did you find up there?" Dina said enough. Not the number, not the specifics of the military artifacts or the bearer bonds or the numismatic collection, but the shape of it. That Raymond had been entrusted with something significant, that the property held more than the county assessment suggested, that she and Mia were staying, were fixing the lodge, were planning to be part of the county and not just in it. Lorraine listened to all of it without interrupting, which was notable because Lorraine was not a woman who usually let silence stand. When Dina finished, Lorraine looked at her coffee for a moment. Then she said, "I told you it was a money pit." "Yes," Dina said. "You did. I was wrong." "Yes, you were." Lorraine picked up her coffee, looked at Dina over the rim with the expression of a woman recalibrating. "You're going to fix the whole property?" "The whole property." "The road too?" "Especially the road." Lorraine set the cup down. "Phil does good road work. You'd want him involved." "I was planning to ask him," Dina said. Lorraine nodded. Once, the decisive nod of a woman deciding something. "Then, the contractor you've had up there for the roof. That's Emmett Garza. He's the best one in the county. Everyone knows it. You couldn't do better." "I know," Dina said. "He does good work. I've been watching him." Lorraine looked at her for a moment longer, the kind of look that was an assessment, though less of whether Dina was worth time and more of whether she was the kind of person who understood what she was walking into. Then she stood and took her coffee and said, "Come in when you need propane. I'll have it ready." It was the smallest possible version of welcome. It was also real. The regional newspaper story ran on Friday. Dina did not read it, by choice, But Curtis told her it was accurate in its broad facts and restrained in its specifics, the legal team having declined comment on anything beyond the confirmed filing, which meant the reporter had been forced to work from public records alone. The public, part of the clearing's texture. The generator continued its reliable hum. Mia continued her systematic documentation of the property in her sketchbook, which had grown to 4 volumes since they'd arrived. She found Raymond's personal record on the 9th of the 14 days. She found it because she had gone back into the lodge loft, which she had converted into Mia's sleeping space, to check on a rafter that the contractor had flagged as needing inspection. She was up there with a flashlight checking the rafter when she noticed that the knee wall at the north end of the loft had a section that sounded different from the sections on either side of it. Not hollow, dense, muffled in the way of a space that was full rather than empty. She found the release the same way she had found the kitchen floor cache, by pressing along the seam until something gave. The panel opened inward on a small space, perhaps 3 feet deep, lined in cedar the way the old craftsmen lined things when they wanted them to last. Inside was a wooden box, simple, well-made, the kind of box that had been built to hold something specific and had been built carefully so the thing would be held well. Inside the box were letters. Not the formal kind, not legal documents or government correspondence. Personal letters, handwritten, bundled in groups by year with small rubber bands that had gone brittle and snapped when she touched them, so that she had to be careful to keep the bundles in order. The letters were from a woman named Clara, and they spanned from 1987 to 2003, which was 16 years of correspondence, and they told a story that the workshop logs and the formal notebooks did not tell, and that Raymond had evidently kept separate from all of it, up here in the loft knee wall, for the same reason you kept any private thing private, because it was yours and no one else needed it. Clara had known about the repository. Not the specifics, but the shape of it, the fact that Raymond had committed himself to something that meant he was staying and she was not. The early letters were the letters of a woman deciding something. The middle letters were the letters of a woman who had decided and was making peace with the decision. The later letters, after 2003, stopped, which told their own story. Dina read enough to understand the shape and then stopped, because some things were not hers to read completely even when they were in her knee wall in her lodge in her inherited clearing. She repackaged the letters carefully, replaced them in the cedar box, and replaced the panel. She sat for a while in the loft with the afternoon light coming through the small north window. She thought about Raymond choosing the repository over Clara. She thought about what that choice had cost, sustained over 16 years of letters from a woman who had made her own choice, and was honoring it by staying in correspondence even after she'd gone. She thought about commitment and what it actually looked like when it was real, which was not grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but the slow accumulation of quarterly assessments and cedar-lined boxes and letters kept in knee wall spaces because they mattered and deserved to be kept even if they also had to be kept private. She thought about Raymond writing in his 1999 marginal note, "Some days I think this was the wrong choice, and some days I know it was the only choice." She understood both halves of that sentence completely. She went back downstairs and made dinner and didn't tell Mia about the letters, because some things were Raymond's and would stay Raymond's, and that was its own kind of respect. 3 days before the 14 were up, a federal office in Washington made contact. Not through any channel that was threatening or official in a confrontational sense. A phone call to the legal team's office, politely worded, referencing the 14C program and its dissolution and asking whether the estate of Raymond Carver wished to engage in a voluntary consultation regarding assets potentially subject to the program's historical inventory. The lead attorney called Curtis, who called Dina, and explained the call in terms that were precise and calibrated. "The call means they know," Curtis said, "or they have strong enough information to make an inquiry. The voluntary consultation framing is designed to open a door before the documentation is filed. Once filed, they have no angle. Right now, they're trying to establish contact before the filing. What do I do? Nothing. Your attorneys decline the call with the appropriate language. We continue on the 14-day timeline. Are they going to be a problem?" Curtis paused in the way he paused when he was being precise. There are people in that office who would prefer the dissolution agreement be revisited. They will find that it cannot be. Raymond's 30 years of documented custody, combined with the agreement's own language, closes that door completely. But they will try the door before accepting it's closed. That's what the call was. And when the documentation is filed, the door closes, Curtis said. Finally and completely. 2 days later, the bond verification was complete. The legal team filed. And on the 14th day, as Curtis had said with the confidence of someone who had managed timelines for 30 years, Dina Carver's ownership of the Ridgeline Lodge property and all structures and contents thereon became a matter of public record in Calder County. She was in the clearing when Curtis called to tell her. She was standing near the old concrete building with Mia beside her, both of them watching the contractor's crew work on the east wing roofline, which was nearly finished now, the new timbers fitting into the old structure with a precision. Records were interesting enough. Estate of Raymond Carver yields unexpected assets. Property assessed at under $5,000 found to contain federally documented repository materials. Legal ownership confirmed following 37-year private custodianship. The number did not appear in the newspaper story, which was exactly as planned, but the framing of federally documented repository materials was enough to generate its own momentum. The first call from a national outlet came Saturday. The second came Sunday. By Monday, there were 4. The legal team handled all of them. Dina had been coached on what she would and would not say if it came to direct contact, which it would, eventually, once the story found its proper scale. Curtis had been clear about that. You can control the timing, but not the fact of it. And the fact of it is that what you have is genuinely historically significant, and the world will want to know about it. The question is not whether you tell the story, but how. She thought about how. She thought about it in the workshop, which she had begun organizing in a way that was hers, moving Raymond's tools into categories that made sense to her hands rather than his, not changing anything that mattered, just making it usable. She thought about it while cooking dinner on the cast-iron stove, which she had learned to manage over 6 weeks of daily practice. The way you learned any skill that was inconvenient at first, and then simply became how you did a thing. She thought about it while walking the North Tree line, which was hers, the full 40 acres, the boundary markers clear and correct, and confirmed by the 2014 survey that Hollis Vance had spent 12 years pretending was wrong. She thought about Raymond, and about what he had wanted. He had written, in the notebook from the kitchen floor, "This house has too much love left in it to stand empty." Except that hadn't been Raymond. That had been a different story, a different woman's note. Raymond's words had been different. Raymond had written, "What's in there belongs to a history that is bigger than me and might be bigger than you. Be careful with it." He had meant, "It matters." He had meant, "Don't be careless." He had meant, "Understand what you have before you act on it." She had spent 2 months understanding. She thought she was close enough now to begin acting. The number became public knowledge on a Tuesday, not through any press release or deliberate disclosure, but through the bond verification documents, which were part of the public filing and which someone at a financial publication had obtained through a records request. The publication ran the number with the appropriate qualifications, approximate, pending final authentication of certain asset categories, subject to market conditions. $345 million. The headline was the kind that got shared on platforms that didn't usually share county estate news. Her phone was off that day. Curtis had suggested it, and she had agreed. She was in the clearing with Mia and Emmett Garza's crew, watching the final section of East Wing roofing go on, the new shingles fitting against the old log structure with a rightness that was satisfying in the way of repairs that restore rather than replace. Emmett came and stood beside her when his crew was running at capacity and didn't need his attention for a few minutes. He was a man in his 50s who had built his reputation in the county on a straightforward principle. He did what he said he'd do, and he said only what he could do. In 6 weeks of working on the lodge, she had come to respect this so completely that she had already mentally extended his contract to include the access road and the workshop roof and the long outbuilding renovation that was going to take the better part of a year. He looked at the new roof line and then at the whole structure. "It's a good lodge," he said. "It is," Dina said. "Raymond built the east wing himself. Did you know that?" She hadn't known it. He said, "I found his tool marks in the framing. The way a man works wood is individual. Raymond worked careful. You can tell." She looked at the east wing, at the new shingles over Raymond's careful framing. She thought about a man who built things himself, who maintained things himself, who kept his word himself for 30 years without asking anyone to witness it. "He built good," she said. "He did," Emmett said, and went back to his crew. The response to the number was the thing that changed the texture of daily life in Calder Crossing most visibly, and most quickly, and in some ways most uncomfortably, because it arrived before she had built the things that would let her navigate it with the steadiness she wanted. The county was small enough that everyone knew everyone, and everyone knowing everyone meant that the reorientation that happens when someone in a small place becomes nationally known happened in front of her, in real time, in the diner and the feed store and the hardware store and at the edge of the access road, where people sometimes stopped their cars to look at the track leading into the trees. Some of it was simple curiosity. Some of it was the specific social recalibration of people deciding where someone fit now that the coordinates had changed. A woman at the hardware store who had been politely indifferent on 2 previous visits suddenly found a reason to be helpful, to suggest alternatives, to take more time than efficiency required. The man at the gas station in Calder Crossing, where she stopped twice a week, told her he'd gone to school with Raymond, which he had not mentioned on any of the previous 14 times she had stopped. A county commissioner called her attorney's office to express the county's interest in being helpful during what he described as an exciting time for Calder County. She recognized all of it. The recalibration, the way people's behavior adjusted to the new coordinates. She was not angry about it, because anger required a belief that things should be otherwise, and she had spent enough time in the world to understand that people behaved in ways that reflected their understanding of where they stood relative to you, and that when that understanding changed, behavior changed, and that this was simply how human beings operated and was not in itself a moral failure. It was a fact, to be noted and accounted for, and neither resented nor rewarded. What she did not do was let the recalibration change the way she moved through the county. She kept going to the same diner. She kept buying propane from Lorraine. She kept letting Phil check the generator with the same handshake agreement they'd had since he first drove up the track, which was not money but a standing invitation to use the workshop's equipment whenever he needed it, because the workshop had things a diesel mechanic could use, and Phil had a small operation without full resources, and it was a reasonable trade. She kept being the person she had been before the number was public, because that person was who she actually was, and the number didn't change that, and she was not going to let anyone's recalibration suggest to her that it did. Hollis Vance's recalibration was the most specific and the most satisfying to observe, not because she took pleasure in other people's difficulty, but because what he recalibrated toward was silence. The boundary dispute had gone to the attorneys, and the attorneys had looked at the 2014 survey and the county court ruling and the dissolution filing, and said something to Hollis Vance's attorney that caused Hollis Vance's attorney to send a letter withdrawing the dispute. The letter was 3 sentences. Formal, precise, giving nothing that was not required. She read it at the kitchen table and then filed it in the folder she had labeled Property Legal, alongside the 2014 survey and the court ruling and the filing documents. She didn't call anyone to tell them. There was no one to tell in the way people tell things when they want the telling to mean something about winning. She just filed it and went back to the generator maintenance log she had been updating. Curtis, on his last visit before returning to his home city, sat at the kitchen table for the final time and said, "You handled all of this remarkably well. For someone who had no prior experience with a situation of this kind." Dina poured coffee and said, "I've been broke for 4 years. That's good practice for handling things you didn't prepare for." Curtis looked at her. "That's one way to frame it. It's the accurate one." He smiled, the small specific smile of a man who recognized something true when he heard it. He said, "What happens next? To you? To the property?" She had been ready for this question because she had been answering it for herself for weeks. She said, "The lodge gets finished. Properly. The road gets done. The workshop becomes operational again. Not for what Raymond used it for something else." She paused. "I've been talking to an industrial heritage organization that's interested in the military artifacts. They have the appropriate expertise in a proper museum context. I'd rather they go somewhere they can be seen and understood than sit in a vault." "What about the medals and the numismatic collection?" "The collection stays intact for now. Dr. Solis thinks 3 pieces should go to a public institution, the genuinely irreplaceable ones. He's identified the right institutions. I'm working with him on the terms." She looked at the window, at the clearing. "The rest will be liquidated carefully over time through the right channels, in a way that doesn't disrupt the relevant markets." "And the property?" "The property is home." She said it without hesitation, The way you said something you had been certain of for long enough that it no longer needed qualification. Mia goes to school in Calder County next fall. A real school, not the remote arrangement we've been managing. The East Wing becomes her studio. She's 9, and she needs a proper space. Curtis looked at the window. Raymond would approve of all of that. She thought about the marginal note from 1999. Some days I think this was the wrong choice, and some days I know it was the only choice. She thought about Raymond, alone in this clearing, keeping his word, writing letters in a notebook to a person he would never meet. I think he'd mostly just be glad the lodge is getting the roof fixed, she said. Curtis laughed, which was the first time she had heard him laugh, and it was a good sound, genuine and unguarded. He drove away down the access road in the unremarkable gray sedan, and she stood at the edge of the clearing and watched until the road curved and took him into the trees. And then she stood there a moment longer in the spring afternoon, the sound of Emmett's crew finishing for the day, carrying from the East Wing, the generator's steady hum from the workshop, a bird somewhere in the old trees whose name she didn't know yet, but was learning. She was learning a lot of things. The spring became summer the way it did in places with real seasons, not gradually, but suddenly, a week of warmth that crossed a threshold and didn't come back below it. The clearing changed. Grass grew at the edges where the ruts of the access road had been, filling in as the road surface itself was laid properly, packed gravel over a compacted base that Emmett's crew and Phil together had designed for year-round use. The lodge exterior was repainted, not to look new but to look cared for. The original color matched as close as the paint supplier could manage. The East Wing stood fully repaired and level, its roofline matching the original structure so precisely that you could not tell, from outside, where the new work ended and the old began. The workshop was operational by June. Dina had made a decision about the workshop that had come to her slowly, and then all at once, the way decisions came when they were the right ones. She was going to use it, not for what Raymond had used it for. She was not a machinist and was not going to become one. But she had grown up watching her grandfather work with his hands, had always had that particular connection between thought and physical making, and the precision tools in the workshop were tools, and tools were for using. She hired a machinist named Reyes, who was 63 and had retired from a manufacturing operation in the next county, and who came to the workshop on a consultation basis and spent 3 weeks teaching her what the equipment did and how to do it without injuring herself. He was direct in the way of people who had taught for years and didn't see the point in softening corrections. She was a good student. He told her this once, without elaboration, and she took it as the compliment it was. She made things, small things at first, the learning scale work of someone developing a new skill, then more complex things. She was not yet good, but she was getting better in the measurable way of someone working at something regularly. And the work itself was satisfying in a way she had not expected, and then, on reflection, had expected entirely, because the satisfying thing about working with your hands was not the product but the process, the fact that thinking and doing happened together without a gap between them. Mia watched and drew. She had developed, over the summer, a practice of coming into the workshop in the afternoon and drawing whatever Dina was doing, not the finished thing but the doing of it, the hands on the equipment, the concentration, the adjustment and readjustment. That was the actual texture of learning. She was building a record, the way she had been building records since she was 5, though the record had grown more intentional now, more aware of itself. She had started talking about what she was doing as a project, a document of the Ridgeline property and the people in it. She had not said this to anyone outside the family, but she had shown Dina 12 volumes of sketchbooks going back to the first day in the clearing, and Dina had looked at those 12 volumes and understood that her daughter had been doing something serious for months without making any claims about it. "You should show these to someone," Dina said. "Who?" "Someone who knows what they're looking at." Mia thought about it. Then, the woman from the Industrial Heritage Organization, the one who came for the artifacts. She looked at things carefully. Her name was Dr. Yelena Park, and she had come for 3 days in early June to assess the military artifacts and facilitate their transfer documentation. She had the careful, specific attention of a person who had spent a career looking at things no one else had bothered to look at properly, and she had been, during those 3 days, the most interested in Mia of any of the professional visitors, asking her questions about the drawings and listening to the answers without condescension. Dina called Dr. Park, who came back for a day in late July, and who looked at the 12 volumes with the same careful attention she had given the military artifacts, and who said, afterward, sitting at the kitchen table with a coffee she had not touched, "Your daughter has made a historical document. She is 9 years old, and she has produced a primary source record of a property of genuine national significance from the day it changed hands." She paused. "I know 3 institutions that would want to see this." Mia was in the doorway of the kitchen. She had drawn Dr. Park looking at the sketchbooks, quick and accurate in the way she drew everything. "Which institutions?" Mia asked. Dr. Park looked at her. The kind of look that was a real assessment, the kind that didn't adjust for age. "I'll send you a list," she said. "We should talk about archival quality materials. What you're using is good, but there are better options for longevity." Mia got a notebook out and wrote this down. Dina watched her daughter write and felt the specific, cellular pride of a parent watching a child be exactly who they are, without apology or performance, just fully themselves in the particular way that was only theirs. It was August when her mother came. The visit had been planned for weeks, arranged carefully, with the same care Dina brought to things she understood were significant. She had not wanted her mother to come before the lodge was in a condition that said clearly and unmistakably what she wanted it to say. Not wealth, not display. Home. The specific condition of a place that had been chosen and committed to and worked on, that showed in its repaired roofline, and its clean workshop, and its new garden bed along the south wall, where Mia had planted things with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to her sketchbooks. Her mother arrived on a Saturday, driving her own car, which was an act of independence Dina recognized as deliberate, the message that she had come on her own terms. She stood in the clearing and looked at the lodge for a long moment without saying anything, which was unusual, because her mother was a woman who had opinions and expressed them promptly. Then she said, "You fixed the roof." "The east wing, yes. And the main ridge." Her mother looked at the workshop. "The outbuilding? That's the workshop. I've been using it." Her mother looked at her. "For what?" "For making things. It's something I'm learning." Another long look. Then, in the tone she used when she was saying something she had decided to say rather than something that had simply emerged, "You look different." Dina thought about this. Different how? Like you did before Marcus. She didn't have an answer for that right away. She stood in the clearing in the August morning and thought about who she had been before Marcus, about the specific quality of her own presence before 4 years of difficulty had thinned it down to the essential operational minimum. She thought about the checking account and the eviction notice and the gas station at 5 in the morning. She thought about the way she had stood on the lodge steps the first day Hollis Vance came and kept the stillness she had built. "Maybe I do," she said. Her mother looked at the concrete building, sealed and quiet. She didn't ask about it. This surprised Dina, who had expected the question. Later, over dinner at the kitchen table, she asked her mother why she hadn't asked. Her mother said, "Because it's yours. Whatever it is. It was Raymond's, and now it's yours, and it's not mine to ask about unless you want to tell me." "Do you want to know?" "I want to know what you're going to do with your life. The rest is detail." Dina told her. The lodge, the road, the workshop, Mia's studio in the East Wing, Mia's school in the fall, Dr. Park's interest in the Sketchbook project, the Industrial Heritage Organization, and the military artifacts now in proper institutional care. The plan for the rest of it, the medals and the collection, careful and slow and in consultation with people who understood the relevant markets. Her mother listened to all of it. When Dina finished, she said, "And you? What about me? What do you want?" Dina looked at the kitchen window, at the clearing in the evening light. She thought about the question, not the version she had been answering for weeks, the practical version, the "what are you going to do with it" version. The actual question, what she wanted. She said, "I want to be here. I want to learn the workshop properly. I want to watch Mia grow up in a place that's hers." She paused. "I want to not be afraid of money." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then, "You were never afraid of money. You were afraid of not having it." "That's different." Dina thought about this. "Yes," she said. "That's right." Her mother stayed 3 days. On the last morning, early, before the drive back, she walked the north tree line with Dina and Mia, the full perimeter of the north 40 acres, which took an hour and a half at a walking pace, and covered terrain that shifted from open to dense to a creek crossing and back to open at the corner marker. They walked mostly in silence, the companionable silence of people who knew each other well enough not to require conversation, with Mia ranging ahead and behind and sideways, drawing as she went. At the corner marker, her mother stopped and put her hand on the marker post, the physical fact of it, the boundary that was real and documented and not subject to anyone's claims. She looked at the trees. Raymond was right to keep it, she said. And you were right to come. Dina said, you told me not to. I know. Her mother looked at her. I was wrong. She said it the way she said things she had decided to say. Clearly, without qualification. Not as a performance of humility, but as a statement of fact. I was trying to protect you from another disappointment. I miscalculated what you were capable of. Dina didn't say anything. The woods were full of summer sound, birds and insects, and the small creek running at the corner of the property. Mia was 50 yards ahead, sitting on a rock, drawing the creek. She thought about all the times her mother's caution had grated on her. About the weak coffee and the form letters logic and the do you know what you're doing. She thought about what it meant to have someone try to protect you from disappointment and get it wrong. About how that was still, at its core, protection. Still care, wearing the wrong clothes for the weather. She said, I know you were. Her mother took her hand. Brief, uncharacteristic, real. Then she let go and they walked on, back toward the lodge, through the old trees and the summer morning. The three of them moving through a place that was theirs. The fall brought the news about Hollis Vance. She heard it from Walt Pruitt, who drove up the access road on an October morning in the same county sheriff's truck he'd had for 30 years, the way a man drove a truck he intended to drive until it stopped working. He sat on the lodge steps with a coffee she made him, the same way as the first time, and told her that Hollis Vance had received a federal inquiry in September related to his time at Meridian Infrastructure Services, specifically regarding the 2009 GSA inquiry about legacy assets, and whether Meridian had taken any action in response to that inquiry beyond the official record. Dina looked at her coffee cup. What kind of action? The kind that constitutes an attempt to locate and access federal property, Walt said, prior to its legal transfer to private ownership. She said, before Raymond died. Before Raymond died, Walt confirmed. And possibly after, before you arrived. She thought about the buyer, 10 years ago, who had walked the property and declined without explanation. She thought about a private contractor who knew the category of what was here, who couldn't get through the custodianship without creating a legal problem, who had instead tried the boundary dispute. Is he going to be charged? Walt looked at the tree line. The inquiry is federal. I don't have visibility into what they'll do. What I know is that the inquiry is real and it started the week after your filing became public record. She thought about the federal office that had tried to call before the filing. The voluntary consultation. The door they had tried before Curtis confirmed it was closed. She thought about how many people, at how many levels, had known the general shape of what existed in the Calder County clearing for 37 years without knowing specifically where it was. Had suspected, had looked, had not found it, because Raymond had been exactly what the custodianship agreement required. Reliable, discreet, alone. She said, he never got in. No, Walt said, he never got in. Because of Raymond. And because you moved fast enough, once you understood what you had. She thought about the $500 she had spent, and the $51.40 that had been left, and the decision made at the county courthouse on a Tuesday morning when she had no reason to believe it was the right decision except that it was the only one available. She thought about the way things looked like luck from the outside when they were actually the accumulation of small choices made by someone who kept choosing forward even when forward was unclear. I was scared, she said. The whole time. Walt looked at her. I know. He paused. Scared people who keep moving are the only kind that accomplish things. The brave ones are a myth. She laughed. It came out genuine. Walt finished his coffee and stood up. He looked at the lodge, at the east wing roofline, at the new access road, at the cleared clearing. He looked at all of it with the expression of a man who had been in the county long enough to know what things looked like before and could appreciate what they looked like now. Raymond would be satisfied, he said. Dina looked at the lodge. She thought about satisfied, about what it meant relative to a man who had spent 30 years alone in a clearing keeping a word he had given. She thought about Raymond writing in 1999, "Some days I know it was the only choice." She thought about what it meant to know something was the only choice and do it anyway, for 30 years, without anyone watching. Yeah, she said. I think he would. Mia started school in Calder Crossing in September. 3rd grade, real classroom, 7 other children whose families had been in the county for generations and who received Mia, with the particular social complexity of children who were not entirely sure where to put someone new who did not fit the categories they had. Mia navigated this with the adaptability of a child who had moved through difficult circumstances without losing herself in them, which was to say she was polite, and she was present, and she kept her sketchbook in her bag, and took it out at recess and drew. And within 3 weeks 2 other children were drawing with her, not as well, not with the same practice, but with the same impulse. Her teacher called Dina in October to say that Mia was exceptional, not in the way teachers said this to be kind, in the way teachers said it when they meant it and wanted the parent to know they meant it. She said Mia wrote essays with an adult's sense of structure and a child's sense of wonder, which she identified as rare. She said Mia had asked, during a unit on local history, whether the class could visit the Ridgeline property, and that she was bringing this to Dina's attention before agreeing to anything, because she wanted Dina to have control over the decision. Dina said yes. The class visited on a Thursday in October, 16 children and a teacher and 2 parent chaperones, arriving in a school bus that managed the new access road with considerably more ease than Betty's truck had managed the old one. They stood in the clearing, and Mia walked them through it with the confidence of a child explaining something she understood completely, pointing out the old trees, the spring, the workshop, the lodge with its repaired roofline. She did not take them into the concrete building, which Dina had not discussed with her, but which Mia understood, in the way she understood things she had absorbed through proximity and attention, was not the part of the story that was for showing yet. At the end of the visit, standing in the clearing with the October light coming through the old trees at the same angle it had come through them on the first day Dina had stood in the clearing and felt arrived, one of the chaperones, a woman named Janet whose family had farmed in Calder County for 3 generations, came to stand beside Dina and said, "This property should have been properly valued a long time ago. It was valued at $4,800, Dina said. Janet looked at the lodge. I mean by people, not the county assessor. Dina thought about Raymond. About 37 years of solitude and precision and quarterly assessments. About the letter left in the kitchen floor that said what's in there belongs to a history that is bigger than me. Some things get valued when the right person finds them, she said. Janet looked at her, then at Mia, who was walking the perimeter of the clearing with 3 of her classmates, explaining something about the tree line. All of them listening with the complete attention children gave to things that felt genuinely important. You're the right person, Janet said. Simply, without performance. Like a fact. Dina watched her daughter. Watched the 3 classmates listening. Watched the old trees at the clearing's edge, 200 and 300 years old, unchanged since Raymond had stood under them, and since his father had, and since the family had built the original lodge in the 50s, and since people had moved through the forest long before the lodge existed, before the clearing was cleared, before anyone had decided this particular piece of land had a value that could be written on a tax form. I'm working on it, Dina said. The first time the number meant something personal rather than abstract was the day she paid off her mother's house. She did it without announcing it, without drama, through the attorneys, a wire transfer that cleared a mortgage her mother had been carrying for 22 years, the one that had been taken out when Dina's father left, and her mother had needed to refinance to keep the house, and had been paying on it ever since at a rate that left very little room for anything else. The attorney called her mother on a Tuesday morning and told her it was paid. Her mother called Dina that afternoon and was silent for a long moment on the phone and then said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Dina said. "I wanted to." Another silence. Then, "Thank you," said the way her mother said things she had decided to say. Clearly, without qualification. Real. She established a fund for Calder County students who needed school supplies, quietly, administered through the county school district without her name attached, because the gesture was not about her name. She funded the repair of the access road on the county register, the public section, the piece that had been impassable for 20 years and which cut off 3 other rural properties that deserved better access. She did this through the county commissioner's office and declined any public acknowledgement, because the road was a practical thing and practical things didn't require ceremonies. She talked to Bet about what Bet needed, and Bet said she needed nothing, and Dina said that wasn't an answer to the question she was asking. And Bet said her car was 10 years old, and her roof needed work, and she had a younger sister who had left a bad situation with 2 kids and was trying to get steady. Dina handled all 3 of those things, without fanfare, because Bet had lent her a truck and a phone number at a moment when a truck and a phone number had been exactly what mattered. She thought about the things that had made the difference. Not the number, not the filing, not the specialists and their assessments. The things that had actually made the difference. A truck with a working engine. A phone number to call. A woman named Lorraine who gave her the contractor's name. A deputy who drove up to tell her Raymond's message and didn't ask questions he didn't need to ask. A generator that ran when it was supposed to. Mia's sketchbooks. Raymond's 30 years of quarterly assessments. The chain of small things that had to all be true simultaneously for the outcome to be what it was. She thought about this often in the evenings at the kitchen table, in the particular kitchen light that had struck her from the first morning as being like the inside of a painting. She sat at the table after Mia was in bed, with the fire going and the generator humming in the workshop and the old trees doing what old trees did at night, which was exist without apology and without requiring witness, and she thought about chains of small things and about how you could never trace them all the way back to where they started because they went further than you could follow. Raymond had started one in 1987, or maybe it started earlier, when whoever made the decision to use the Ridgeline property as a repository had looked at Raymond's record and said, "This is the right person." Or maybe earlier than that, when Raymond had built his record, 31 years of signals intelligence, the kind of work that required exactly the qualities the custodianship agreement needed. Or maybe earlier still, when the family had built the lodge in the 50s and Raymond had grown up knowing the land and understanding its isolation not as a hardship, but as a fact, the kind of person who could be alone in a clearing for 30 years and not break under it. Or maybe it started when Clara had left and Raymond had stayed, and in staying had become the person who could do what he did, which was keep his word in a place where no one would ever know if he didn't. She thought about Marcus, about the savings account and the second car and the 10 years of being made to feel small. She used to think of Marcus as damage, as the before point on a timeline that measured her life in terms of what had been taken. She had been thinking about it differently lately, not with forgiveness, which was its own thing and was hers to extend or not extend without reference to anyone else's opinion, but with a different understanding of what it had cost her versus what it had built. The 4 years of difficulty had built things she did not have before. The stillness she had learned to keep under pressure. The discipline of forward motion when forward was unclear. The particular knowledge of what she was capable of, which she had not known fully before because she had not been tested at that scale. She would not have come to the property if the situation had been less desperate. She would have thought about it longer, waited for better information, approached it more cautiously. She would have been practical, in her mother's sense of the word, and practical would have meant too slow, and too slow would have meant someone else walking the access road first, someone with different intentions, someone who would not have stayed. She had stayed because staying had been the only option, and the only option had turned out to be the right one. Not because of luck, because of what she brought to the staying. Raymond had written, "Someone said yes when it mattered. That counts for something." She said yes, Dina thought, to an empty property and a broken gate and $500 and a checking account that said $51.40. She said yes to all of it, which was the same yes Raymond had. Said in 1987, wearing different clothes for different circumstances, but the same fundamental yes. She sat at the kitchen table and thought about that, about the continuity of it, the way a certain kind of commitment persisted across time and distance, and people who would never meet each other. There was a day in November, 4 months after the filing and 8 months after she had driven up the access track for the first time with $500 in Mia and 2 bags, when she drove to the county records office to handle a routine documentation matter and walked past a gas station on Calder Crossing's Main Street. Not the gas station where she had worked, that was 3 counties away, but close enough in every material respect to stop her. The same flat canopy light, the same smell of morning fuel, the same clock on the wall through the glass, showing the hour in the way of clocks in places where time was measured by shifts. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at it for a moment. A woman was inside at the register, early shift, the particular posture of someone doing a job that required presence but not engagement. Dina recognized the posture because she had held it herself for a long time. She walked in and bought a coffee. The woman at the register rang it up without looking up. Dina paid and said thank you, and the woman looked up at the thank you, because people said it rarely enough that it registered. She was in her 30s, with the kind of tiredness around her eyes that was not lack of sleep, but sustained pressure, the accumulated weight of a life managed on a margin too thin for comfort. Dina almost said something. Stood there with the coffee for a moment on the edge of saying something. She didn't, because you couldn't say certain things to a stranger in a gas station without them landing wrong, without the weight of the number in the background making them something other than what they were. Some truths could only be offered when they were asked for. She left, drove back up the access road, thought about the woman at the register the whole way. She talked to Curtis about it in December, during a phone call that had shifted over the months from professional to something closer to collegial. She told him about the woman at the register and the not knowing what to say. He said, "You're describing the problem with unexpected wealth that nobody discusses publicly. You can see who needs what you have. You can't reach all of them. That knowledge is its own kind of weight. How do you manage it? By being specific," he said. "You can't help everyone. That's not a failure. It's arithmetic. What you can do is identify the places where your specific resources meet specific needs in a way that's sustainable and real and not just about reducing the weight of the knowing." He paused. "You're already doing it. The school fund. The road. Bet. The institutional transfer of the artifacts. It doesn't feel like enough. It never does. That's not a reason to stop. It's a reason to be organized about it." She thought about organized. About Raymond's logs, the 30 years of quarterly assessments, the specific accountable attention to what he had been given. She thought about what organized generosity looked like at a scale she could sustain. She talked to a foundation specialist named Rosario in January, a woman who had spent 20 years helping people with unexpected resources build something lasting with them. Rosario was direct and did not attach sentiment to money in the way some people did, which Dina found clarifying. They met twice before Rosario said, "You want to do 3 things. You want to support your immediate community in a way that doesn't create dependency or resentment. You want to create something that continues after you, that doesn't require you to be the decision maker for everything. And you want to do all of this without making it about the number." "Yes," Dina said. "That's exactly right." The Ridgeline Foundation was established in February. Small by the standards of foundations, deliberately. Focused on Calder County and 3 adjacent counties, on families in specific kinds of difficulty, the kind Dina understood from the inside. Emergency housing stability, educational materials, access to professional services that were unavailable in rural counties without means. The kind of help that created conditions for people to find their own way forward, rather than the kind that created a relationship of ongoing need. She named it after the property rather than after herself, because the property was the source and the source deserved the acknowledgement. Rosario managed the structure. Dina sat on the board and made decisions and showed up to the work of it, which was real work, not ceremonial. She had not expected to find it as absorbing as she did. It felt like the workshop, like thought and action happening together without a gap. She said this to Mia one evening, at the kitchen table, after a board meeting that had gone long. Mia was drawing, but looked up. "Is it because you understand what they're going through?" "Partly. Because it's specific. Because there's a person and a situation and a decision, and then something happens or it doesn't, and you can see the result." She paused. Money is abstract until it isn't. Until it's a roof that gets fixed or a school year that happens. Then it's real. Mia drew for a moment. "Then, Raymond's money is still doing something." "Not just Raymond's," Dina said. "Ours." Mia nodded with the seriousness she brought to things she agreed with completely, and went back to drawing, and Dina went back to the board meeting notes, and the fire did its work in the stone fireplace. She was still there when the fire burned down, which was late, and when she went upstairs Mia's light was off and her sketchbook was on the nightstand, and through the east wing window the stars were very clear above the old trees. She stood at the window for a moment and looked at them. The same stars Raymond had looked at for 30 years from the same clearing, just rearranged slightly by the passage of seasons, the slow drift of the sky's map. She thought, what do you do when everything changes? She thought, you stay. You fix the roof. You learn the workshop. You walk the north tree line. You put your daughter in school. You sit at the kitchen table in a light that looks like the inside of a painting, and you understand, slowly and then all at once, that the life you were building toward, the one you had been trying to reach since before Marcus and through Marcus and after Marcus, through $51 in gas station shifts and eviction notices taped inside cabinet doors, was not waiting somewhere else. was not contingent on a number or a filing or a concrete building with 3 levels below grade. It was here. It had been here. It had been here the first morning she stood in the clearing and felt arrived, before she knew what arrived meant in the full and finally unqualified sense of the word. She turned off the light and went to bed in a house that was hers, on land that was hers, in a clearing that was hers, in a county she was learning to belong to, with her daughter sleeping in the next room, and the old trees standing in the dark outside, and the spring running at the north edge of the property, and the workshop quiet, and the generator off for the night, and the concrete building sealed, and the stars doing their patient work overhead. She slept without the particular guardedness that had been in her sleep for 4 years, the animal alertness of someone who needed to be ready to move. She slept the way you slept when you were not going anywhere, when the thing you had been running toward, without knowing it was running, had turned out to be a place you could stop. She slept, and in the morning she woke up and made coffee in the kitchen with the painting light, and started another day of staying. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.